The Imperium exists as a parallel dimension to real space, a roiling ocean of psychic energy that reflects the collective emotions, thoughts, and spiritual essence of all sentient life. Within this tumultuous realm, the raw stuff of souls coalesces into entities of unimaginable power and malevolence. The four ruinous powers, Khorne, Tzeentch, Nurgle, and Slaanesh, represent the most potent manifestations of mortal emotion given form and consciousness within the warp. These beings are not merely gods in the traditional sense, but rather living embodiments of fundamental aspects of sentient existence: rage and violence, change and ambition, decay and despair, and excess and sensation. Chaos does not originate from some external source of evil, but rather emerges from the very nature of conscious thought itself. Every act of violence feeds Khorne's essence, every scheme or desire for change strengthens Tzeentch, every moment of suffering or acceptance of inevitability nourishes Nurgle, and every pursuit of pleasure or perfection empowers Slaanesh. This symbiotic relationship between the material universe and the Imperium creates a feedback loop where mortal actions continuously strengthen the Chaos gods, who in turn exert greater influence over the material realm. The manifestation of chaotic influence in real space occurs through multiple vectors, each tailored to the specific nature of the ruinous power seeking to extend its dominion. Khorne's influence typically manifests through escalating violence and bloodshed. A minor dispute between workers in a manufactorum might gradually escalate into full-scale riots, with participants finding themselves consumed by an inexplicable rage that demands ever more brutal expressions. The Blood God's touch can transform disciplined Imperial Guard regiments into frenzied berserkers who turn their weapons on former comrades, driven by an overwhelming compulsion to spill blood regardless of allegiance or reason. Tzeentch operates through more subtle means, weaving his influence into the natural ambitions and desires for knowledge that exist within mortal minds. A tech adept seeking forbidden archaeotech might find themselves drawn deeper into heretical research, each discovery leading to greater corruption as they pursue ever more dangerous knowledge. The changer of ways plants seeds of ambition in the minds of planetary governors, gradually corrupting their desire for legitimate advancement into treasonous schemes against the Imperium itself. His influence often appears as fortunate coincidences or seemingly beneficial opportunities that slowly lead the recipient down a path of damnation. Nurgle's corruption spreads through despair and the acceptance of decay, often beginning with genuine hardship that the plague god then amplifies and perpetuates. A world suffering from famine or disease might find its population gradually embracing the futility of resistance, welcoming the numbness that comes with accepting their fate. The Grandfather's gifts manifest as plagues that bring not just physical corruption, but spiritual resignation, transforming victims into willing servants who spread both disease and hopelessness to others. Slaanesh's influence targets the pursuit of perfection and sensation, corrupting natural desires for excellence or pleasure into obsessive compulsions. An artist seeking to create the perfect sculpture might find themselves driven to increasingly extreme measures, eventually using living subjects or forbidden materials in their work. The Dark Prince's touch can transform legitimate pleasures into addictive compulsions that gradually consume the victim's entire existence, leading them to commit increasingly depraved acts in pursuit of ever more intense experiences. The psychological vulnerabilities that make Imperial citizens susceptible to chaos corruption are deeply rooted in the fundamental nature of human existence within the 41st millennium. The Imperium's harsh authoritarian structure, while necessary for survival against countless threats, creates conditions that inadvertently foster the very emotions that strengthen the ruinous powers. Citizens living under constant surveillance and oppression often harbor deep resentments and frustrated ambitions that provide fertile ground for chaotic influence. Fear represents one of the most significant vulnerabilities, as the constant threat of alien invasion, heretical uprising, or simple administrative purging creates a pervasive atmosphere of terror throughout Imperial society. This fear often manifests as either paralyzing despair that feeds Nurgle or explosive rage that empowers Khorne. Citizens who witness the arbitrary nature of Imperial justice may begin to question the righteousness of their government, opening their minds to alternative philosophies that promise power, knowledge, or freedom from suffering. Desperation drives many toward chaos worship when legitimate channels fail to provide relief from suffering. A factory worker facing starvation due to increased tithe demands might initially pray to the emperor for deliverance, but when no aid comes, they become vulnerable to whispered promises of abundance from Nurgle's cults or offers of strength from Khorne's followers. The Imperium's inability to provide adequate care for its countless billions creates vast populations of desperate individuals willing to embrace any alternative that promises improvement in their circumstances. Intellectual curiosity, while potentially beneficial, becomes dangerous in a society that strictly controls access to knowledge. Tech adepts who encounter archaeotech beyond their understanding, scholars who discover historical inconsistencies in imperial doctrine, or simply curious individuals who ask too many questions about forbidden subjects may find themselves drawn to Tzeentch's promises of enlightenment. The Imperium's necessary restrictions on dangerous knowledge create an environment where the simple desire to understand becomes a pathway to corruption. Pride and ambition, natural human traits that drive achievement and progress, become weapons in the hands of chaos when channeled through the Imperium's rigid hierarchical structure. An officer passed over for promotion despite merit, a noble family facing decline in status, or an administrator frustrated by bureaucratic limitations may find their legitimate desires for advancement twisted into treasonous schemes that serve the ruinous power's agenda. The role of the warp as a conduit for chaotic influence cannot be overstated, as this parallel dimension serves as both the source of psychic power and the medium through which chaos exerts its will upon real space. Every world in the Imperium exists in close proximity to the Immaterium, separated only by the thin barrier of reality that can be weakened or breached under specific conditions. Areas of high emotional intensity, such as battlefields, execution sites, or locations where great suffering has occurred, often develop thin spots in this barrier that allow chaotic influence to seep through more easily. Warp storms represent the most dramatic manifestation of chaotic influence breaking through into real space, cutting off entire systems from imperial control and subjecting their populations to direct exposure to the Immaterium's corrupting energies. During these events, the normal laws of physics become unreliable, time flows inconsistently, and the thoughts and fears of mortals can manifest as physical reality. Populations trapped within warp storms often emerge fundamentally changed, if they emerge at all, having been subjected to generations of exposure to pure chaotic energy. Psykers serve as particularly dangerous conduits for chaotic influence due to their direct connection to the Immaterium through their psychic abilities. Every untrained Psyker represents a potential gateway for demonic incursion, as their uncontrolled psychic emanations can attract the attention of warp entities seeking entry into real space. Even sanctioned Psykers who have undergone soul-binding rituals remain vulnerable to corruption, particularly when exposed to extreme stress or forced to channel power beyond their normal limits. The astronomic in itself, while essential for imperial navigation, creates a massive psychic beacon that draws the attention of chaos entities throughout the galaxy. The thousands of Psykers who sacrifice their lives daily to maintain this beacon must constantly resist the whispers and temptations of warp entities attracted to their psychic emanations. The facility housing the Astronomicon requires constant vigilance against corruption, as any failure in its psychic defenses could result in a demonic incursion at the very heart of the Imperium. Astropaths, who facilitate faster-than-light communication across the Imperium, face similar risks as they project their consciousness through the warp to deliver messages. Each transmission exposes them to the chaotic energies of the Immaterium, and prolonged exposure can result in gradual corruption or sudden possession by demonic entities. The Imperium accepts these risks as necessary costs of maintaining galactic communication, but the constant attrition of astropaths to chaotic influence represents an ongoing vulnerability in Imperial infrastructure. Navigator houses, with their genetic mutations that allow them to perceive the warp directly, face unique challenges in resisting chaos corruption. The Navigator's third eye, which enables them to guide ships through the Imperium, also makes them acutely sensitive to the whispers and temptations of the ruinous powers. Many Navigator bloodlines maintain strict traditions and rituals designed to protect against corruption, but the constant exposure to warp energies means that some degree of mutation and spiritual contamination is inevitable within their ranks. The process of corruption rarely occurs instantaneously, instead developing gradually through repeated exposure to chaotic influence or through deliberate cultivation by existing cultists. Initial corruption often manifests as subtle changes in behavior or thought patterns that might be dismissed as stress, fatigue, or natural personality evolution. A previously loyal citizen might begin expressing minor complaints about imperial policy, questioning established doctrine, or showing unusual interest in forbidden subjects. These early signs often go unnoticed by both the individual and their associates, allowing the corruption to deepen before detection becomes possible. Physical corruption typically follows spiritual contamination, beginning with minor changes that can be easily concealed or explained away. Unusual skin discoloration, abnormal hair growth, or slight alterations in body odor might represent the first visible signs of chaotic taint. As corruption progresses, these changes become more pronounced and difficult to hide, often forcing the corrupted individual to seek out others who share their condition or to retreat from normal imperial society entirely. The Imperium's response to suspected corruption reflects the serious threat that chaos represents to imperial civilization. The Inquisition maintains vast networks of informants and investigators dedicated to detecting and eliminating chaotic influence before it can spread. However, the sheer scale of the Imperium and the subtle nature of early corruption means that many cases go undetected until they have reached advanced stages. The balance between vigilance and paranoia represents a constant challenge for imperial authorities, as excessive suspicion can create the very desperation and resentment that makes populations vulnerable to chaos in the first place. The manifestation of chaos corruption follows distinct patterns that align with the fundamental nature of each ruinous power, creating four primary pathways through which mortal souls descend into damnation. These paths reflect not merely different approaches to worship, but entirely separate philosophies of existence that corrupt different aspects of human nature and society. Understanding these pathways becomes crucial for imperial authorities seeking to identify and eliminate heretical influence before it can metastasize into full-scale rebellion or demonic incursion. Khornate corruption appeals most strongly to those who possess natural aggression or who have been shaped by violence into instruments of war. The blood god's influence typically manifests first within military organizations, gladiatorial arenas, and the brutal gang hierarchies that dominate imperial underhives. Unlike the subtle corruption employed by other ruinous powers, Khorne's influence operates through direct amplification of existing violent tendencies, gradually stripping away restraint and moral consideration until only the desire for bloodshed remains. The initial stages of Khornate corruption often appear as enhanced combat effectiveness or increased aggression that might initially be welcomed by military commanders seeking to improve their forces' battlefield performance. Imperial Guard regiments operating in prolonged combat zones frequently develop cultures that glorify violence beyond tactical necessity, with soldiers beginning to collect trophies from fallen enemies or engaging in unnecessary brutality during pacification operations. These behaviors, while concerning, often remain within the bounds of acceptable military conduct until they progress to more obvious signs of corruption. Gladiatorial pits serve as particularly effective breeding grounds for Khornate cults, as the institutionalized violence provides perfect cover for the gradual corruption of participants and spectators alike. What begins as legitimate combat sport slowly transforms into increasingly brutal spectacles that prioritize bloodshed over skill or entertainment value. Pit fighters find themselves consumed by an insatiable hunger for violence that extends beyond the arena, while audiences develop addictions to witnessing death that can only be satisfied through ever more extreme displays of brutality. The transformation of these gladiatorial venues into Khornate shrines occurs gradually, with subtle modifications to arena design that incorporate symbols and architectural elements pleasing to the blood god. Sand mixed with dried blood creates fighting surfaces that carry spiritual significance, while weapon racks are arranged in patterns that form crude representations of Khorne's mark. Spectator areas develop unofficial hierarchies based on proximity to violence, with the most devoted followers claiming seats closest to the killing floor, where blood splatter is most likely to reach them. Murder gangs represent another common vector for Khornate corruption, particularly within the anarchic environments of underhive settlements, where imperial authority maintains only tenuous control. These organizations typically begin as legitimate security forces or criminal enterprises focused on territorial control, but Khornate influence gradually transforms their operational priorities from profit or protection toward pure violence for its own sake. Gang members find themselves engaging in increasingly brutal initiation rites, torture sessions that serve no interrogative purpose, and random acts of violence against civilians that provide no tactical advantage. The leadership structures within Khornate gangs inevitably evolve toward might makes right hierarchies, where advancement requires the ritual murder of superiors in single combat. These challenges become formalized ceremonies that incorporate Khornate symbolism, with gang members forming circles around combatants while chanting prayers that invoke the blood god's favor. Winners often consume portions of their defeated opponents or collect specific body parts as trophies that demonstrate their worthiness to lead through violence. Weapons maintenance within Khornate cults takes on ritualistic significance that extends far beyond practical considerations. Cultists spend hours each day sharpening blades, cleaning firearms, and performing maintenance rituals that incorporate prayers to Khorne and offerings of their own blood. Weapons are named and treated as sacred objects, with many cultists developing personal relationships with their armaments that border on romantic obsession. The most devoted followers often modify their weapons with spikes, serrated edges, or other features designed to maximize suffering rather than combat effectiveness. Tzeentchian corruption operates through entirely different mechanisms, targeting intellectual curiosity, political ambition, and the natural human desire for knowledge and advancement. The Changer of Ways works through existing power structures within imperial society, gradually corrupting bureaucrats, scholars, and administrators who possess access to information or influence that can serve his grand designs. Unlike Khorne's direct approach, Tzeentchian corruption often remains invisible for years or decades, while cultists work to implement elaborate schemes that serve their patrons' incomprehensible agenda. Imperial bureaucracy provides ideal conditions for Tzeentchian corruption due to its vast scope, complex hierarchies, and the natural ambitions of individuals seeking advancement within the system. Mid-level administrators who discover inefficiencies or corruption within their departments may initially attempt to address these problems through legitimate channels, but when their efforts are blocked or ignored, they become vulnerable to alternative approaches that promise more effective solutions. Tzeentch's influence manifests as convenient opportunities, helpful contacts, or access to information that allows these individuals to bypass normal procedures and achieve their goals through increasingly questionable means. The progression from legitimate reform efforts to outright heresy often occurs so gradually that corrupted officials remain unaware of their spiritual contamination until they have committed acts that place them irreversibly beyond imperial redemption. A planetary tax collector, who begins by slightly adjusting tithe calculations to account for local hardships, might gradually develop more sophisticated methods of manipulating imperial records, eventually creating complex networks of falsified documentation that serve Tzeentchian schemes spanning multiple worlds and centuries. Forbidden knowledge serves as both the lure and the corruption vector for many Tzeentchian cults, particularly among tech adepts, scholars, and other intellectuals who encounter information that challenges established imperial doctrine. The discovery of archaeotech that predates the dark age of technology, historical records that contradict official imperial histories, or scientific principles that suggest alternatives to accepted dogma creates cognitive dissonance that Tzeentch exploits through promises of greater understanding and enlightenment. These knowledge-seeking cults often develop elaborate hierarchical structures based on levels of initiation and access to progressively more dangerous information. Lower-level members might be exposed only to minor historical inconsistencies or technological improvements that seem beneficial, while higher initiates gain access to truly heretical knowledge involving Xenos technology, warp manipulation, or the true nature of the Imperium's founding. The gradual revelation of forbidden knowledge creates psychological dependency among cultists, who become addicted to the sense of enlightenment and superiority that comes from possessing secret information. Mutation represents a common side effect of prolonged exposure to Tzeentchian influence, though these changes often manifest as beneficial alterations that enhance the cultist's intellectual or psychic abilities rather than obvious physical deformities. Enhanced memory, improved pattern recognition, or the development of minor psychic talents might initially appear as natural gifts or the results of intensive study, but they actually represent the first stages of spiritual and physical transformation that will eventually render the cultist inhuman. The most successful Tzeentchian conspiracies operate across multiple generations, with corrupted bloodlines passing down both genetic mutations and heretical knowledge through carefully maintained family traditions. These dynasties often achieve positions of significant influence within imperial society, using their accumulated power and resources to advance schemes whose ultimate purposes remain hidden even from many of the participants. Noble houses, administratum departments, and even space marine chapters may unknowingly serve Tzeentchian agendas through the influence of corrupted members who have spent decades or centuries maneuvering themselves into positions of authority. Nurgle-like corruption appeals to populations suffering from genuine hardship, disease, or despair, offering acceptance and numbness as alternatives to continued struggle against overwhelming adversity. The plague god's influence spreads most effectively through underhive populations, refugee camps, and other environments where imperial citizens face daily battles against starvation, disease, and violence without hope of meaningful improvement in their circumstances. Nurgle's gifts transform this suffering from a source of anguish into a form of spiritual communion that provides comfort through shared misery. The initial stages of Nurgle-like corruption often appear as beneficial developments that provide genuine relief from suffering. Plague victims who should have died from their diseases instead find themselves stabilizing in states of living decay that allow them to continue functioning despite massive physical deterioration. Starvation victims discover that they can survive on minimal nutrition while their bodies slowly consume themselves, maintaining consciousness and mobility long past the point where death should have claimed them. These apparent miracles attract desperate individuals who view any form of continued existence as preferable to death. Plague cults typically develop around the distribution of Nurgle's gifts, with early converts serving as living advertisements for the benefits of accepting the grandfather's embrace. These individuals demonstrate that disease and decay need not mean death or incapacitation, showing potential converts that suffering can be transformed from agony into a form of spiritual fulfillment. The visible presence of plague bearers who continue to function despite obvious corruption provides powerful testimony to Nurgle's benevolence toward those who accept his dominion. The social structures within Nurgle-like cults reflect the egalitarian nature of disease and decay, with hierarchies based on the extent of corruption and the length of service to Nurgle rather than traditional markers of status or achievement. The most respected cult members are those who have achieved the greatest levels of physical corruption while maintaining their ability to spread the grandfather's gifts to new converts. These individuals often display collections of diseases that should be mutually exclusive or fatal, serving as living libraries of Nurgle's diverse plagues. Underhive populations prove particularly susceptible to Nurgle-like corruption due to their constant exposure to industrial toxins contaminated water supplies, and overcrowded living conditions that facilitate disease transmission. The Imperium's inability to provide adequate medical care or sanitation services for these massive populations creates environments where disease spreads rapidly and conventional treatment options remain unavailable to most residents. When Nurglite cultists arrive offering relief from suffering through acceptance rather than cure, many desperate individuals find the proposition appealing. The transformation of underhive settlements into Nurglite strongholds occurs through the gradual replacement of normal social services with cult-provided alternatives. Plague bearers establish medical clinics that treat symptoms through the application of blessed diseases rather than conventional remedies, food distribution centers that provide sustenance infused with Nurgle's gifts, and communal gathering spaces where the faithful can share their afflictions and find comfort in collective suffering. These services often prove more reliable and accessible than legitimate imperial alternatives, creating practical incentives for conversion beyond purely spiritual considerations. Slaaneshi corruption targets the pursuit of perfection, excellence, and sensory experience, appealing particularly to artists, nobles, and other individuals with the leisure time and resources necessary to pursue aesthetic or hedonistic interests. The Dark Prince's influence operates through the amplification of natural desires for beauty, pleasure, and achievement, gradually transforming healthy ambitions into obsessive compulsions that demand increasingly extreme expressions to provide satisfaction. Imperial nobility provides fertile ground for Slaaneshi corruption due to their wealth, education, and relative freedom from the survival concerns that dominate the lives of most imperial citizens. Noble houses often maintain extensive collections of art, literature, and cultural artifacts that serve as focal points for Slaaneshi influence, particularly when these collections include items of Xeno's origin or pre-imperial human cultures that incorporated different aesthetic or philosophical principles. The competitive nature of noble society, with its emphasis on demonstrating superiority through displays of wealth, taste, and cultural sophistication, creates natural pathways for corruption through the pursuit of ever more exclusive and extreme forms of excellence. Artistic communities within imperial society face particular vulnerability to Slaaneshi influence due to their professional focus on creating beauty and evoking emotional responses in their audiences. Painters, sculptors, musicians, and writers who achieve mastery in conventional techniques often find themselves seeking new challenges and forms of expression that push beyond established boundaries. The Dark Prince's whispers suggest techniques, materials, and subjects that promise to elevate their work to unprecedented levels of impact and meaning, gradually leading them toward increasingly transgressive forms of art that incorporate forbidden elements. The progression from legitimate artistic ambition to Slaaneshi corruption typically involves the gradual abandonment of moral and aesthetic restraints in pursuit of ever more intense emotional responses. A portrait painter might begin by seeking more lifelike representations of their subjects, then progress to capturing psychological states, emotional extremes, and finally the spiritual essence of their models through techniques that require increasingly intimate and invasive interactions. Musicians might pursue perfect acoustic environments, then explore the emotional manipulation of their audiences, eventually developing compositions that induce specific psychological states or even physical transformations in listeners. Pleasure cults centered around Slaaneshi worship often develop elaborate ritualistic practices that combine aesthetic appreciation with sensory indulgence, creating ceremonies that serve as both religious observances and artistic performances. These gatherings typically feature carefully choreographed combinations of music, visual art, exotic foods, rare wines, and various forms of physical pleasure designed to overwhelm the participants' senses and induce states of spiritual transcendence. The most sophisticated Slaaneshi cults employ professional artists, chefs, perfumers, and other specialists to create multisensory experiences that surpass anything available through legitimate imperial cultural institutions. The hierarchical structures within Slaaneshi cults reflect the competitive nature of the pursuit of perfection, with advancement based on the ability to conceive and execute increasingly elaborate and extreme forms of aesthetic or hedonistic expression. Senior cultists often serve as patrons and mentors for newer members, providing access to resources, knowledge, and opportunities necessary for the pursuit of transcendent experiences. These relationships frequently involve complex exchanges of favors, artistic collaboration, and shared participation in progressively more transgressive activities that bind participants together through mutual complicity in forbidden practices. The identification of potential cultists represents one of the most critical phases in the expansion of chaos worship throughout Imperial society. Experienced cult leaders develop sophisticated methods for recognizing individuals whose psychological profiles, social circumstances, or spiritual vulnerabilities make them susceptible to corruption. This process requires careful observation and analysis, as premature approaches can result in exposure to Imperial authorities, while missed opportunities might allow valuable recruits to remain beyond the cult's influence indefinitely. Desperation serves as the most reliable indicator of recruitment potential, particularly among populations facing immediate threats to survival or well-being. Factory workers subjected to increased production quotas without corresponding improvements in rations, families facing eviction from their hab blocks due to administrative errors, or individuals suffering from diseases that exceed their ability to afford treatment all represent prime candidates for cult recruitment. These circumstances create psychological states where individuals become willing to consider alternatives that would normally be rejected without serious contemplation. Cult recruiters operating in industrial districts often position themselves near employment centers, medical facilities, or food distribution points where desperate individuals naturally congregate. They observe potential targets over extended periods, noting behavioral patterns that indicate increasing desperation, such as repeated attempts to access services, visible deterioration in physical condition, or expressions of frustration with Imperial bureaucracy. The most effective recruiters develop detailed profiles of their targets before making initial contact, ensuring that their approach addresses specific needs and concerns rather than relying on generic promises of improvement. The recruitment of desperate individuals typically begins with small acts of kindness or assistance that appear entirely innocent and unconnected to any larger organization. A cult member might offer to share their meal with a hungry worker, provide directions to someone lost in the underhive, or simply engage in sympathetic conversation with an individual experiencing obvious distress. These initial interactions serve multiple purposes. They establish positive associations with the cult member, demonstrate the organization's willingness to provide practical assistance, and create opportunities for gathering additional information about the target's specific circumstances and needs. Ambition represents another significant vulnerability that experienced recruiters learn to identify and exploit. Imperial society's rigid hierarchical structure creates countless individuals who possess the intelligence, skills, or drive necessary for advancement, but lack the connections, resources, or opportunities required to achieve their goals through legitimate channels. Mid-level administrators who watch less capable colleagues receive promotions due to political connections, skilled artisans whose work goes unrecognized by their guilds, or military officers whose tactical innovations are ignored by hidebound superiors all harbor frustrations that make them vulnerable to alternative approaches to advancement. Tzeentchian cults prove particularly adept at recruiting ambitious individuals through carefully orchestrated encounters that appear to offer legitimate opportunities for advancement. A cult member posing as a successful merchant might approach a struggling trader with offers of partnership in lucrative ventures, while another might present themselves as a well-connected noble interested in patronizing talented artists or craftsmen. These approaches succeed because they address the target's genuine aspirations while providing plausible explanations for why such opportunities are being offered to relative strangers. The cultivation of ambitious recruits requires more sophisticated approaches than those used with desperate individuals, as these targets typically possess greater education, social awareness, and access to resources that could expose cult activities if suspicions are aroused. Recruiters must demonstrate genuine knowledge of the target's field of expertise, provide evidence of their claimed connections and resources, and offer opportunities that represent realistic steps toward the target's stated goals. The most successful recruitment efforts involve multiple cult members working in coordination to create elaborate deceptions that withstand scrutiny from intelligent and naturally suspicious targets. Curiosity about forbidden knowledge attracts individuals who might otherwise remain immune to cult recruitment due to their comfortable circumstances and strong loyalty to the Imperium. Scholars who encounter historical inconsistencies in their research, tech adepts who discover archaeotech that challenges established doctrine, or simply educated individuals who begin asking questions about aspects of imperial society that seem illogical or contradictory, all represent potential recruits for knowledge-seeking cults. These individuals often initiate their own corruption by actively seeking answers to questions that imperial doctrine declares off-limits. The identification of intellectually curious targets requires cult members to maintain extensive networks within educational institutions, research facilities, and other organizations where forbidden knowledge might be encountered. Librarians, junior tech adepts, and administrative personnel who have access to restricted materials but lack the authority to conduct independent research often serve as unwitting sources of information about individuals who have requested access to suspicious materials or asked problematic questions during their studies. Recruitment approaches targeting curious individuals typically involve the gradual revelation of information that addresses their specific questions or concerns. A cult member might anonymously leave relevant documents where the target will discover them, arrange for chance encounters with individuals who claim to possess additional knowledge about subjects of interest, or simply engage in philosophical discussions that introduce new perspectives on established doctrine. The key to success lies in allowing targets to believe that they are discovering forbidden knowledge through their own initiative rather than being deliberately led toward heretical conclusions. Existing corruption within imperial society provides cult recruiters with ready-made networks of individuals who have already demonstrated willingness to violate imperial law or doctrine for personal benefit. Corrupt administrators who embezzle funds from their departments, military officers who sell supplies on black markets, or nobles who engage in illegal trade with Xenos merchants have already crossed moral boundaries that make them more susceptible to further corruption. These individuals often possess valuable skills, resources, or access that make them particularly attractive recruits despite their existing criminal activities. The approach to recruiting already corrupt individuals differs significantly from methods used with desperate or ambitious targets, as these individuals typically understand that they are being approached for illegal purposes and evaluate offers based on practical considerations rather than emotional appeals. Cult recruiters must demonstrate that their organization offers superior protection from imperial authorities, more lucrative opportunities than existing criminal enterprises, or access to resources and capabilities that cannot be obtained through conventional illegal activities. The process of spiritual corruption begins immediately upon successful recruitment, though the techniques employed vary significantly depending on the target's psychological profile and the specific chaos power that the cult serves. The fundamental principle underlying all corruption efforts involves the gradual erosion of the target's moral boundaries and loyalty to the Imperium through carefully calibrated exposure to heretical ideas and practices. This process must proceed slowly enough to avoid triggering psychological resistance while maintaining sufficient momentum to prevent the target from reconsidering their involvement. Seemingly innocent activities serve as the primary vehicle for initial corruption, as they allow new recruits to participate in cult practices without immediately recognizing their heretical nature. Social gatherings that feature unusually elaborate meals, artistic performances, or intellectual discussions create positive associations with cult membership while subtly introducing elements that violate imperial doctrine. A Slaaneshi cult might host dinner parties that feature exotic foods and entertainment that gradually become more elaborate and transgressive, while a Tzeentchian organization might sponsor scholarly discussions that slowly introduce forbidden historical perspectives or theoretical frameworks. The provision of gifts and assistance to new recruits serves multiple purposes in the corruption process, as it creates feelings of obligation and gratitude, while demonstrating the cult's ability to provide benefits that legitimate imperial institutions cannot match. These gifts are carefully selected to address the specific needs or desires that made the individual susceptible to recruitment in the first place. A desperate worker might receive food, medical treatment, or assistance with housing problems, while an ambitious official might gain access to valuable information, influential contacts, or opportunities for advancement. The gradual escalation of gift-giving and assistance creates psychological dependency that makes it increasingly difficult for recruits to abandon their cult involvement. As the benefits provided become more significant and the recipient's reliance on cult support increases, the prospect of losing access to these resources becomes a powerful deterrent to defection. The most sophisticated cults engineer situations where recruits become financially, professionally, or socially dependent on continued cult membership, creating practical barriers to departure that supplement the spiritual corruption taking place simultaneously. Promises of power represent the ultimate lure for many potential recruits, particularly those who have experienced frustration with their inability to influence their circumstances through legitimate means. Cult recruiters present their organizations as sources of hidden knowledge, supernatural abilities, or political influence that can transform powerless individuals into figures capable of shaping events according to their will. These promises are typically supported by carefully orchestrated demonstrations that appear to validate the cult's claims about their access to extraordinary capabilities. The demonstration of seemingly supernatural powers serves as one of the most effective recruitment tools available to chaos cults, as it provides tangible evidence that the organization possesses capabilities beyond those available through imperial institutions. These demonstrations might involve minor psychic phenomena, the apparent healing of injuries or diseases, the fulfillment of specific predictions about future events, or the manipulation of circumstances in ways that appear to defy natural explanation. The key to success lies in ensuring that these demonstrations address concerns or desires that are specific to the target audience, while remaining subtle enough to avoid attracting unwanted attention from imperial authorities. Initiation rites mark the formal transition from recruitment to full cult membership, serving both practical and spiritual purposes in binding new members to their chosen organization. These ceremonies are designed to create psychological transformation through combinations of sensory overload, emotional manipulation, and symbolic actions that represent the abandonment of previous loyalties and the acceptance of new spiritual allegiances. The specific nature of initiation rites varies dramatically between different types of cults, reflecting the particular characteristics and preferences of their patron deities. Khorne initiation ceremonies typically involve acts of violence that serve to desensitize new members to bloodshed, while demonstrating their commitment to the cult's martial philosophy. New initiates might be required to participate in ritual combats, execute captured enemies, or engage in self-mutilation that leaves permanent scars serving as marks of their dedication. These rites often take place in locations that have been consecrated through previous acts of violence, such as abandoned fighting pits, execution chambers, or battlefields where the psychic residue of death and suffering creates an atmosphere conducive to spiritual corruption. The blood spilled during Khorne initiation ceremonies is collected and used in the creation of ritual implements, the consecration of weapons, or the marking of sacred symbols that serve to focus the cult's spiritual energy. New initiates are often required to consume portions of this blood or to use it in the creation of personal totems that will serve as focal points for their ongoing spiritual development. The act of voluntary blood consumption represents a fundamental violation of imperial doctrine regarding the sanctity of human life and serves as a psychological barrier that makes return to orthodox belief significantly more difficult. Tzeentchian initiation rites focus on the revelation of forbidden knowledge and the demonstration of the initiate's commitment to the pursuit of change and transformation. These ceremonies typically involve the presentation of heretical texts, the performance of complex rituals that manipulate minor warp phenomena, or the revelation of hidden truths about imperial history or doctrine that challenge the initiate's previous understanding of reality. The psychological impact of these revelations is carefully managed to create feelings of enlightenment and superiority rather than confusion or distress. The binding oaths sworn during Tzeentchian initiations often involve complex verbal formulations that incorporate multiple layers of meaning and symbolism. New initiates must demonstrate their understanding of these concepts through the successful completion of intellectual challenges or the creation of original works that reflect their grasp of the cult's philosophical principles. The most sophisticated Tzeentchian organizations require initiates to contribute original research or insights to the cult's collective knowledge base, ensuring that new members become active participants in the ongoing development of heretical doctrine rather than passive recipients of established teachings. Nurglite initiation ceremonies center around the voluntary acceptance of disease and decay as expressions of spiritual communion with the plague god. New initiates typically undergo ritual infections with blessed plagues that serve as both marks of membership and sources of ongoing spiritual connection to Nurgle's influence. These diseases are carefully selected to produce visible symptoms that identify cult members to each other while avoiding immediate incapacitation that would prevent the initiate from fulfilling their duties to the organization. The communal nature of Nurglite initiation reflects the egalitarian philosophy that underlies the cult's approach to spiritual development. New initiates join existing members in group ceremonies that emphasize shared suffering and mutual support, creating bonds of fellowship that transcend traditional social hierarchies. The exchange of bodily fluids, the sharing of contaminated food, and the collective recitation of prayers that celebrate decay and entropy all serve to create psychological identification with the cult community while establishing spiritual connections to Nurgle's influence. Slaaneshi initiation rites involve the pursuit of transcendent experiences through carefully orchestrated combinations of aesthetic appreciation and sensory indulgence. New initiates participate in elaborate ceremonies that feature music, visual art, exotic foods, rare perfumes, and various forms of physical pleasure designed to overwhelm normal sensory limitations and induce states of spiritual ecstasy. These experiences are presented as glimpses of the perfect existence that awaits those who fully embrace Slaanesh's philosophy of endless improvement and refinement. The artistic components of Slaaneshi initiations often require new members to demonstrate their own creative abilities through the production of original works that reflect their understanding of the cult's aesthetic principles. These might include musical compositions, paintings, sculptures, or literary works that push beyond conventional boundaries while maintaining sufficient technical skill to be genuinely impressive. The creation of these works serves both as a test of the initiate's commitment and as a contribution to the cult's ongoing cultural activities. Blood oaths represent a common element across all types of chaos cult initiations, serving as both practical security measures and spiritual binding rituals. These oaths typically involve the mingling of the initiate's blood with that of existing cult members or with substances that have been consecrated to the cult's patron deity. The physical act of bloodletting creates permanent scars that serve as identifying marks, while the spiritual significance of the oath creates psychological barriers to betrayal or defection. The specific wording of blood oaths is carefully crafted to create multiple layers of obligation and commitment that extend beyond simple loyalty to the immediate cult organization. These oaths often include pledges to advance the cause of chaos in general, to protect fellow cultists from imperial persecution, and to prioritize cult interests over personal safety or conventional moral considerations. The most comprehensive oaths include specific commitments to perform particular actions or achieve certain goals within defined timeframes, creating ongoing obligations that maintain the initiate's active involvement in cult activities. Demonic pacts represent the most serious form of spiritual binding available to chaos cults, involving direct agreements between individual cultists and warp entities that serve their patron deity. These pacts typically offer specific benefits such as enhanced physical capabilities, supernatural knowledge, or protection from enemies in exchange for ongoing service and the eventual surrender of the cultist's soul to demonic possession or consumption. The negotiation and completion of demonic pacts requires extensive preparation and carries significant risks even for experienced cult members. The process of establishing demonic pacts typically begins with extended periods of meditation, fasting, and ritual preparation designed to attune the cultist's spiritual essence to the frequencies of their chosen demon. This preparation often involves the use of psychoactive substances, sensory deprivation, or extreme physical stress to alter normal consciousness and facilitate communication with warp entities. The most successful pact makers develop personal relationships with specific demons over extended periods, building trust and understanding that enables more favorable terms in their eventual agreements. The sacred texts used by chaos cults serve multiple functions in the indoctrination process, providing both practical instruction in heretical practices and spiritual justification for the abandonment of imperial doctrine. These documents range from simple pamphlets containing basic cult teachings to elaborate grimoires that detail complex rituals and philosophical frameworks. The most effective cult texts are those that address specific concerns or questions that new members bring to the organization, providing answers that seem more satisfactory than those offered by orthodox imperial doctrine. Forbidden grimoires represent the most dangerous category of cult literature, containing detailed instructions for summoning demons, manipulating warp energies, and performing rituals that can produce dramatic supernatural effects. Access to these texts is typically restricted to senior cult members who have demonstrated both the spiritual development necessary to survive exposure to their contents and the loyalty required to prevent their misuse. The gradual revelation of increasingly dangerous knowledge serves as both a reward for faithful service and a means of ensuring continued commitment to the cult's objectives. The corruption of imperial doctrine represents one of the most insidious forms of cult indoctrination, as it allows heretical organizations to present their teachings as legitimate interpretations of established religious and philosophical principles. Skilled cult theologians identify ambiguities, contradictions, or gaps in official imperial doctrine that can be exploited to support alternative interpretations that serve chaos interests. These corrupted teachings often prove particularly effective with educated recruits who possess sufficient knowledge of orthodox doctrine to appreciate the sophistication of the heretical arguments being presented. The process of doctrinal corruption typically begins with the identification of genuine problems or inconsistencies within imperial teaching that create legitimate grounds for questioning established interpretations. Cult theologians then develop alternative explanations that address these problems while gradually introducing heretical concepts that redirect the believer's spiritual development toward chaos worship. The most successful corrupted doctrines maintain sufficient similarity to orthodox teaching to avoid immediate detection while creating pathways for progressive radicalization that eventually lead to full apostasy. The organizational structures that govern chaos cults reflect both the practical necessities of operating under constant threat of imperial persecution and the spiritual hierarchies demanded by the ruinous powers themselves. These systems must balance the need for operational security with the requirement for clear chains of command that can coordinate complex activities across multiple cells and geographical regions. The most successful cult organizations develop sophisticated structures that compartmentalize information and authority while maintaining sufficient coordination to achieve their strategic objectives. The foundation of most cult hierarchies consists of individual cells containing between 3 and 12 members who maintain direct contact with each other, but possess limited knowledge of the broader organization's structure or activities. These base-level units typically operate under the leadership of a single individual who serves as the primary point of contact with higher levels of the cult hierarchy. Cell leaders receive instructions, resources, and intelligence from their superiors, while shielding their subordinates from direct exposure to more senior cult members, whose capture could compromise entire regional networks. Cell membership is carefully managed to ensure that each unit contains individuals whose skills and backgrounds complement each other, while maintaining the operational security necessary for long-term survival. A typical cell might include a corrupt administrator who provides access to Imperial records and facilities, a skilled combatant capable of handling security concerns, a psyker who can facilitate communication with other cells or provide supernatural capabilities, and several support members who contribute specialized knowledge or resources. This diversity ensures that cells can operate independently for extended periods while contributing meaningfully to larger cult objectives. The recruitment patterns within individual cells follow strict protocols designed to minimize the risk of Imperial infiltration or accidental exposure. New members are typically introduced through existing cult members who can vouch for their reliability and commitment, with potential recruits undergoing extended observation periods before being granted access to sensitive information or activities. The most security-conscious cells maintain elaborate cover stories that explain the group's regular meetings and activities in terms that would satisfy casual Imperial scrutiny, such as workers' social clubs, religious study groups, or professional associations. Communication between cells occurs through carefully established protocols that minimize direct contact while ensuring reliable information transfer. Dead drops, coded messages embedded within legitimate correspondence, and brief encounters in public locations serve as the primary means of inter-cell communication. Many cult networks employ professional couriers who maintain no knowledge of the messages they carry, using individuals such as traveling merchants, pilgrim groups, or Imperial bureaucrats whose duties require regular movement between different locations. The intermediate levels of cult hierarchies typically consist of regional coordinators who oversee multiple cells within specific geographical areas or functional domains. These individuals, often referred to as cult magisters, possess detailed knowledge of their assigned cells' capabilities and activities, while maintaining limited awareness of operations outside their direct sphere of responsibility. Magisters serve as the primary planning and coordination authorities for regional cult activities, translating strategic directives from higher levels into specific operational instructions for individual cells. Cult magisters typically emerge from the ranks of successful cell leaders who have demonstrated exceptional competence in managing their subordinates while avoiding detection by Imperial authorities. The promotion to Magister level requires not only proven leadership abilities, but also the spiritual development necessary to commune directly with demonic entities or to channel the supernatural powers granted by their patron deity. Many Magisters undergo elaborate transformation rituals that enhance their capabilities while marking them permanently as servants of chaos through visible mutations or psychic alterations. The responsibilities of cult magisters extend far beyond simple administrative oversight, encompassing strategic planning, resource allocation, and the coordination of complex operations that may span multiple worlds or involve hundreds of individual cultists. Magisters must possess detailed knowledge of Imperial security procedures, local political dynamics, and the operational capabilities of competing cult organizations. They often maintain extensive networks of informants and allies within Imperial institutions, criminal organizations, and other groups that can provide intelligence or assistance for cult operations. The selection and training of new Magisters represents one of the most critical decisions facing cult leadership, as these individuals will possess the knowledge and authority necessary to cause catastrophic damage if they defect or fall into Imperial hands. Potential Magisters undergo years of evaluation and testing that assess not only their practical competence, but also their spiritual commitment to their chosen chaos power. The most rigorous selection processes include exposure to demonic influence, participation in major cult operations, and the successful completion of specific missions that demonstrate both loyalty and capability. Dark Apostles represent the highest level of cult leadership, below the demon princes and greater demons, who serve as the ultimate authorities within chaos organizations. These individuals combine extensive practical experience in cult operations with profound spiritual development that grants them direct access to their patron deity's will and power. Dark Apostles typically oversee cult activities across entire sectors or specialized functional domains, coordinating the efforts of multiple magisters while serving as the primary conduits for demonic guidance and supernatural resources. The path to becoming a Dark Apostle requires decades of faithful service combined with exceptional achievements that demonstrate worthiness for elevation to this exalted status. Many Dark Apostles begin as ordinary cultists who display unusual aptitude for leadership or spiritual development, gradually advancing through the cult hierarchy while accumulating the knowledge, experience, and supernatural alterations necessary for their ultimate role. The transformation into a Dark Apostle often involves permanent physical and spiritual changes that enhance the individual's capabilities while making return to normal human society impossible. Dark Apostles possess authority to establish new cult cells, eliminate compromised operations, reallocate resources between different regional organizations, and negotiate agreements with other chaos factions or external allies. Their decisions can affect thousands of cultists and influence events across multiple star systems, making their selection and oversight critical concerns for the broader chaos movement. The most powerful Dark Apostles maintain direct communication with demon princes or other high-ranking warp entities, serving as intermediaries between the material and immaterial realms. The spiritual responsibilities of Dark Apostles include conducting major rituals, overseeing the corruption of new converts, and ensuring that cult activities remain aligned with their patron deity's agenda. These individuals often possess extensive libraries of forbidden knowledge, collections of demonic artifacts, and access to resources that can support large-scale operations. Dark Apostles typically maintain multiple identities and safe houses, using their accumulated wealth and influence to operate openly within Imperial society while coordinating their heretical activities through secure channels. Chaos Champions occupy a specialized position within cult hierarchies, serving as elite military leaders who combine exceptional combat capabilities with deep spiritual commitment to their chosen chaos power. These individuals typically emerge from the ranks of corrupted Imperial Guard officers, Space Marine renegades, or cult members who display unusual aptitude for warfare and leadership under extreme conditions. Champions serve as the primary military assets for cult operations that require direct confrontation with Imperial forces or rival organizations. The development of Chaos Champions involves extensive combat training combined with spiritual practices that enhance their physical capabilities through demonic gifts or warp-induced mutations. Many champions undergo ritual scarification, implantation of demonic artifacts, or exposure to mutagenic substances that grant supernatural strength, speed, or resilience at the cost of their remaining humanity. The most favored champions receive direct blessings from their patron deities that manifest as dramatic physical transformations or the ability to channel demonic powers during combat. Champions typically command specialized military units composed of the most dedicated and capable cult warriors, including corrupted Imperial Guard deserters, underhive gang members, and fanatical converts who have embraced their role as holy warriors in service to chaos. These forces serve as the enforcement arm for cult operations, providing security for major rituals, eliminating threats to cult leadership, and conducting raids against Imperial installations or rival organizations. The most successful champion-led units develop reputations that inspire fear among Imperial forces while attracting new recruits seeking to join proven warriors. The relationship between champions and other cult leaders varies significantly depending on the specific organization and the personalities involved. Some champions serve as subordinates to magisters or dark apostles, receiving strategic direction while maintaining tactical autonomy in the execution of military operations. Others operate as independent leaders who coordinate their activities with civilian cult leadership while maintaining separate command structures for their military followers. The most powerful champions achieve sufficient status to challenge traditional cult hierarchies, potentially establishing their own organizations or demanding recognition as equals to established dark apostles. Cell-based organizational structures provide chaos cults with essential protection against Imperial counterintelligence operations, while enabling coordinated activities across vast geographical areas. The compartmentalization inherent in cellular organization ensures that the capture or elimination of individual cells cannot compromise entire cult networks, as most members possess only limited knowledge of operations outside their immediate sphere of activity. This security model has proven particularly effective against inquisitorial investigations, which often focus on identifying and following connections between cult members to map entire organizations. The operational advantages of cellular organization extend beyond simple security considerations to include enhanced flexibility, improved resource allocation, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Individual cells can modify their activities in response to local conditions without requiring approval from distant leadership, while regional coordinators can reallocate resources between cells based on operational priorities and available opportunities. This decentralized approach enables cult networks to maintain operations even when communication with central leadership is disrupted by Imperial interference or warp storms. The establishment of new cells typically occurs through a carefully managed process that balances the need for expansion with security requirements. Existing cells identify potential recruitment opportunities within their operational areas, conducting preliminary assessments of candidates before requesting authorization to begin formal recruitment efforts. Regional magisters evaluate these proposals based on strategic priorities, available resources, and security considerations before approving the establishment of new organizational units. The geographic distribution of cult cells reflects both practical considerations and the strategic objectives of the broader organization. Urban environments typically support larger numbers of smaller cells that can blend into the general population while accessing the resources and opportunities available in major population centers. Rural areas often host fewer but larger cells that can operate with greater freedom while providing secure bases for training, ritual activities, and the storage of sensitive materials. Industrial regions attract specialized cells focused on sabotage, recruitment of skilled workers, or the acquisition of manufacturing capabilities useful for cult operations. Inter-cult relationships represent one of the most complex aspects of chaos organization, as different factions must balance their shared opposition to imperial authority against the fundamental conflicts inherent in serving competing chaos powers. The rivalry between cults dedicated to different ruinous powers often mirrors the eternal conflicts between their patron deities, creating tensions that can erupt into open warfare even when cooperation would serve their mutual interests. These conflicts are further complicated by personal ambitions, territorial disputes, and theological disagreements that divide cults serving the same chaos power. Khorne and Slaaneshi cults maintain particularly hostile relationships due to the fundamental opposition between their patron deities' philosophies and methods. Khorne organizations view Slaaneshi practices as weakness and decadence that corrupt the purity of martial honor, while Slaaneshi cults regard Khorne brutality as crude and unrefined expressions of power that lack artistic merit or spiritual sophistication. These philosophical differences often manifest as violent conflicts when the two factions encounter each other, with neither side willing to compromise their core beliefs for tactical advantage. The relationship between Tzeentchian and Nurglite cults reflects the opposition between change and stagnation that defines their respective patron deities. Tzeentchian organizations constantly seek to manipulate and transform their environment through elaborate schemes and political maneuvering, while Nurgle-like cults embrace acceptance and entropy as expressions of spiritual truth. These conflicting approaches create natural friction when the two factions operate in the same regions, though their conflicts typically manifest as subtle sabotage and political maneuvering rather than direct violence. Despite these inherent tensions, circumstances occasionally arise that force competing cult factions to cooperate against common threats or to achieve objectives that exceed their individual capabilities. Major imperial crackdowns, inquisitorial investigations, or the arrival of space marine forces in cult-controlled regions can create temporary alliances between otherwise hostile organizations. These partnerships typically involve carefully negotiated agreements that define specific objectives, resource contributions, and territorial arrangements, while maintaining strict limitations on information sharing and operational integration. The most successful inter-cult cooperation occurs when different factions can contribute complementary capabilities to shared objectives without requiring extensive coordination or mutual trust. Khornate military units might provide security for Tzeentchian political operations, while Nurgle-like plague spreaders create diversions that enable Slaaneshi infiltrators to access restricted facilities. These arrangements work best when each faction maintains operational independence while supporting broader strategic goals that benefit all participants. Undivided cults represent a unique category within chaos organization, as these groups acknowledge all four ruinous powers while avoiding exclusive dedication to any single deity. These organizations often serve as intermediaries between competing factions, facilitating cooperation and resource sharing while maintaining neutrality in factional conflicts. Undivided cults typically attract individuals who possess broad knowledge of chaos doctrine or who have been exposed to multiple forms of corruption without developing exclusive loyalty to particular powers. The leadership structures within undivided cults often reflect their eclectic spiritual approach, with authority distributed among specialists who represent different aspects of chaos worship. A single undivided organization might include Khornate champions responsible for military operations, Tzeentchian scholars who handle intelligence and planning, Nurgle-like plague bearers who manage biological warfare capabilities, and Slaaneshi artists who coordinate propaganda and recruitment efforts. This diversity provides operational advantages while creating internal tensions that require careful management to prevent factional conflicts from destroying organizational unity. Regional variations in cult organization reflect the diverse conditions that chaos worshippers encounter across the galaxy's countless worlds and systems. Hive-world cults typically develop elaborate cellular networks that can operate within the complex social and physical structures of massive urban environments, while feral world organizations often adopt tribal structures that mirror local cultural patterns. Forge world cults frequently focus on the corruption of tech adepts and the acquisition of forbidden technological knowledge, while agri-world organizations exploit the isolation and hardship common among agricultural populations. The influence of local imperial institutions creates additional variations in cult organization, as different types of planetary governments and military forces require specialized approaches for infiltration and subversion. Cults operating on worlds with strong ecclesiarchy presence must develop sophisticated theological arguments to justify their heretical practices, while organizations on militarized worlds focus on recruiting from guard regiments and defense forces. The presence of space marine chapters, inquisitorial facilities, or other specialized imperial institutions creates unique challenges that force local cult leadership to adapt their organizational structures and operational methods accordingly. The spiritual practices that define chaos worship extend far beyond simple prayer or meditation, encompassing elaborate ceremonial activities designed to weaken the barriers between real space and the Imperium, while demonstrating absolute devotion to the ruinous powers. These rituals serve multiple interconnected purposes within cult organizations, functioning simultaneously as religious observances, practical tools for channeling warp energies, and psychological mechanisms for deepening the spiritual corruption of participants. The most sophisticated cult ceremonies combine elements of genuine supernatural power with carefully orchestrated psychological manipulation that transforms ordinary imperial citizens into fanatical servants of chaos. The fundamental principle underlying all chaos rituals involves the deliberate violation of natural and moral boundaries that normally separate the material universe from the chaotic energies of the warp. Every ceremonial activity seeks to create conditions that allow demonic influence to penetrate more deeply into real space, whether through the spilling of innocent blood, the recitation of blasphemous prayers, or the performance of acts so morally repugnant that they generate psychic resonances that attract the attention of warp entities. The accumulated spiritual energy generated by these violations creates focal points where the normal laws of physics become unreliable and supernatural phenomena can manifest with increasing frequency and intensity. Blood sacrifice represents the most fundamental and universally practiced form of chaos ritual, as the violent termination of life releases concentrated psychic energy that feeds directly into the Imperium, while demonstrating the cultists' willingness to transgress the most basic moral prohibitions. The selection of sacrificial victims follows specific criteria that vary depending on the cult's patron deity and the intended purpose of the ceremony. Khornate rituals typically demand warriors or other individuals whose deaths will generate maximum spiritual resonance through their connection to violence and conflict, while Tzeentchian ceremonies often require scholars, psychers, or other intellectually gifted victims whose knowledge and mental capabilities can be absorbed by the participating demons. The preparation of sacrificial victims involves elaborate purification rituals that serve to concentrate their spiritual essence while removing any protective influences that might interfere with the ceremony's effectiveness. Victims undergo extended periods of fasting, sensory deprivation, or exposure to psychoactive substances that alter their consciousness and make them more susceptible to warp influence. Many cults employ specialized torturers who understand how to inflict precise combinations of physical and psychological trauma that enhance the victim's psychic emanations without causing premature death that would waste their spiritual potential. The physical implements used in blood sacrifice ceremonies carry deep spiritual significance that extends beyond their practical function as tools for killing. Ritual daggers, ceremonial axes, and other weapons are consecrated through exposure to previous sacrifices, blessed with the blood of cult leaders, or forged from materials that possess natural connections to warp energies. The most prized sacrificial implements include weapons that have claimed the lives of notable Imperial heroes, blades forged from meteoric iron that has passed through warp storms, or ancient artifacts recovered from pre-Imperial human civilizations that practiced similar dark rites. The collection and utilization of sacrificial blood follows elaborate protocols that ensure maximum spiritual benefit from each offering while preventing waste of this precious resource. Specially consecrated vessels, often crafted from human skulls or carved from rare minerals with psychically conductive properties, serve to gather and store blood during ceremonies. This collected blood finds multiple uses within cult activities, serving as ink for the transcription of heretical texts, paint for the creation of blasphemous symbols, or ingredients in the preparation of ritual substances that enhance participants' connection to their chosen chaos power. Ritual murder extends beyond simple sacrifice to encompass elaborate ceremonial killings that serve specific purposes within the cult's broader spiritual and practical objectives. These activities typically target individuals whose deaths will advance cult interests while providing supernatural benefits to the participants. The assassination of imperial officials, the elimination of rival cult leaders, or the murder of individuals who possess knowledge that threatens cult security all represent opportunities for ritual killings that combine practical necessity with spiritual devotion. The the timing and location of ritual murders receive careful consideration to maximize their impact on both the material and spiritual planes. Astrological calculations, consultation with demonic entities, and analysis of local warp conditions all influence the selection of optimal circumstances for conducting these ceremonies. Many cults maintain detailed calendars that identify particularly auspicious dates based on planetary alignments, historical anniversaries, or cyclical patterns in local warp activity that can amplify the spiritual energy generated by ritual killings. The methods employed in ritual murders vary dramatically depending on the specific spiritual objectives and the cult's patron deity, with each chaos power favoring particular approaches that reflect their fundamental nature. Khornate ritual murders typically involve direct combat or gladiatorial contests that allow the victim to die with weapon in hand, ensuring that their death generates maximum spiritual resonance with the blood god's domain. Tzeentchian killings often incorporate elaborate schemes or political assassinations that demonstrate the cult's mastery of manipulation and change, while Nurglite murders might involve the deliberate spread of disease or the use of toxins that cause prolonged suffering before death. Slaaneshi ritual murders pursue the perfect killing, seeking to create deaths that represent artistic achievements in their own right through combinations of aesthetic beauty, emotional intensity, and sensory overwhelm. These ceremonies often require extensive preparation involving the creation of elaborate settings, the composition of musical accompaniments, or the development of exotic poisons that produce specific psychological effects in their victims. The most sophisticated Slaaneshi murder rituals transform the act of killing into performance art that provides transcendent experiences for both participants and observers. The summoning of lesser demons represents one of the most dangerous and ambitious activities undertaken by chaos cults, requiring extensive preparation, significant resources, and participants who possess sufficient spiritual development to survive direct contact with warp entities. These ceremonies seek to create temporary breaches in the barrier between real space and the Imperium that allow demonic beings to manifest physically within the material universe. The successful completion of summoning rituals provides cults with access to supernatural knowledge, enhanced combat capabilities, and direct guidance from entities that serve their patron deities. The preparation for demon summoning begins weeks or months before the actual ceremony, involving the accumulation of specific ritual components, the selection and training of participants, and the identification of suitable locations where the barriers between dimensions are naturally weak or can be artificially compromised. Summoning sites typically feature combinations of natural phenomena and artificial modifications that create optimal conditions for warp manifestation. Underground chambers carved with blasphemous symbols, ancient battlefields where massive bloodshed has occurred, or locations where previous summoning attempts have left permanent psychic scarring all provide enhanced potential for successful demon manifestation. The ritual circles used in summoning ceremonies incorporate complex geometric patterns that serve to focus and contain the chaotic energies released during the manifestation process. These designs combine mathematical principles derived from forbidden archaeotech with symbolic elements that resonate with specific types of demonic entities. The construction of summoning circles requires precise measurements, exotic materials, and the incorporation of physical components that have been consecrated through previous rituals or exposure to warp energies. Iron filings mixed with sacrificial blood, powdered bones from martyred saints, or crystallized warp energy recovered from psyker corpses all serve as common components in circle construction. The incantations employed during demon summoning represent some of the most dangerous knowledge possessed by chaos cults, as these verbal formulations contain compressed information that can alter reality through direct manipulation of warp energies. The learning and recitation of summoning incantations requires extensive preparation that includes meditation practices designed to attune the speaker's consciousness to demonic frequencies, physical conditioning to survive the strain of channeling supernatural forces, and spiritual preparation that involves progressive corruption through exposure to lesser forms of chaos influence. The physical and psychological demands of participating in demon summoning ceremonies often prove fatal to inadequately prepared cultists, as direct exposure to unfiltered warp energy can cause immediate death, permanent madness, or spontaneous mutation into forms that can no longer sustain life in real space. Experienced cult leaders carefully screen potential participants for evidence of sufficient spiritual corruption, psychic sensitivity, and physical resilience to survive the summoning process. Many cults maintain detailed records of previous summoning attempts that document which types of individuals prove most suitable for different categories of demonic manifestation. The manifestation of greater demons represents the ultimate achievement and greatest danger faced by chaos cults, as these entities possess power levels that can reshape local reality while demanding tribute and servitude that often results in the complete destruction of the summoning cult. Greater demon manifestations require preparation that may span decades, involving the coordination of multiple cult organizations, the accumulation of vast resources, and the performance of preliminary rituals that gradually weaken the barriers between dimensions over extended periods. The successful summoning of a greater demon typically marks the culmination of a cult's existence, as these entities rarely permit their summoners to survive the encounter as independent beings. The binding of greater demons represents an even more dangerous undertaking that has historically resulted in catastrophic failure rates approaching total annihilation of the attempting organizations. The spiritual and material resources required for binding rituals exceed the capabilities of most cult networks, while the knowledge necessary to construct effective containment systems remains among the most closely guarded secrets within chaos hierarchies. The few documented successful binding attempts have required the sacrifice of entire cult organizations, the corruption of multiple planetary populations, and the utilization of archaeotech artifacts whose operation violates fundamental principles of Imperial technology. Sacred sites serve as focal points for cult activities, while providing enhanced access to warp energies that amplify the effectiveness of ritual practices. These locations typically combine natural features that create weak points in the barrier between dimensions with artificial modifications that focus and direct supernatural forces according to cult requirements. Ancient burial grounds, sites of massive battles, locations where psykers have died violently, or areas that have been exposed to warp storms all possess inherent characteristics that make them valuable for cult activities. The identification and development of sacred sites requires extensive knowledge of local history, geology, and psychic phenomena that enable cult leaders to recognize locations with optimal potential for ritual use. Many sites require years of preparation involving the performance of preliminary ceremonies, the construction of focusing structures, and the gradual accumulation of spiritual energy through repeated ritual activities. The most valuable sacred sites develop permanent alterations to local reality that persist between ceremonies, creating areas where supernatural phenomena occur regularly and the normal laws of physics operate unreliably. The desecration of imperial shrines represents both a practical objective and a spiritual imperative for chaos cults, as these activities simultaneously eliminate sources of spiritual protection for local populations while creating new focal points for warp energy accumulation. Imperial shrines, particularly those dedicated to the Emperor or Imperial saints, generate psychic fields that interfere with chaos rituals while providing spiritual comfort and protection to nearby populations. The corruption or destruction of these sites removes these protective influences while creating opportunities for establishing new cult centers. The process of shrine desecration follows elaborate protocols that ensure maximum spiritual impact while avoiding premature detection by Imperial authorities. Initial activities typically involve subtle alterations to shrine decorations, the introduction of corrupted texts among legitimate religious materials, or the replacement of blessed substances with contaminated alternatives that gradually corrupt regular worshippers. These preliminary activities create conditions that make subsequent, more dramatic desecration, efforts more likely to succeed, while reducing the risk of immediate Imperial response. The construction of hidden chaos temples requires careful site selection, sophisticated concealment techniques, and ongoing security measures that protect these facilities from Imperial detection while enabling regular cult activities. Underground locations provide natural concealment while offering protection from orbital surveillance and casual discovery, though they require extensive excavation and construction efforts that can attract unwanted attention. Abandoned Imperial facilities, forgotten archaeotech sites, or natural cave systems all offer potential foundations for temple construction while providing some degree of existing infrastructure. The architectural design of chaos temples incorporates both practical considerations related to ritual requirements and symbolic elements that enhance the spiritual atmosphere while demonstrating devotion to specific chaos powers. Khornate temples typically feature combat arenas, weapon storage areas, and trophy displays that celebrate violence and martial achievement, while Tzeentchian facilities include libraries, laboratories, and complex geometric decorations that reflect their patrons' association with knowledge and change. Nurglite temples embrace decay and entropy through deliberate structural deterioration, poor sanitation, and the cultivation of disease organisms, while Slaaneshi facilities pursue aesthetic perfection through elaborate decorations, acoustic optimization, and the incorporation of sensory enhancement technologies. The ongoing maintenance and operation of hidden temples requires dedicated cult members who can manage daily activities while maintaining security protocols that prevent discovery by Imperial authorities. Temple custodians typically live on site or in nearby locations, serving as guardians, ritual specialists, and coordinators for cult activities that require access to temple facilities. These individuals often undergo extensive corruption that enhances their spiritual connection to the temple, while making them unsuitable for operations that require interaction with normal Imperial society. Human sacrifice. This is the most important and widespread ritual practice across all chaos cults, serving both practical and spiritual functions that strengthen the cult's connection to their patron deity while generating the psychic energy necessary for more advanced supernatural activities. The selection of victims follows specific criteria that maximize the spiritual benefit derived from their deaths, with different types of sacrifices serving different ceremonial purposes within the cult's broader ritual calendar. Imperial citizens who possess strong faith in the Emperor provide particularly valuable sacrificial victims, as their spiritual resistance creates additional psychic energy when overcome through ritual torture and corruption. The process of breaking faithful Imperial citizens involves systematic attacks on their beliefs, forced participation in blasphemous activities, and exposure to evidence that challenges their understanding of Imperial doctrine. The spiritual energy released when such individuals finally succumb to despair or embrace heretical beliefs provides powerful fuel for subsequent ritual activities. Children represent especially potent sacrificial victims due to their spiritual innocence and the intense emotional responses their deaths generate among observers. Many cults maintain elaborate procurement networks that acquire children through kidnapping, purchase from criminal organizations, or recruitment from desperate families facing starvation or other extreme hardships. The preparation of child victims often involves extended periods of conditioning designed to maximize their spiritual potential while ensuring their compliance during actual sacrifice ceremonies. The ritual implements used in human sacrifice carry deep spiritual significance that accumulates through repeated use in ceremonial killings. Knives, axes, and other weapons used exclusively for sacrificial purposes develop supernatural properties through exposure to the psychic energy released during victim deaths. The most prized sacrificial weapons include blades that have claimed the lives of Imperial heroes, tools forged from materials with natural connections to warp energies, or ancient artifacts recovered from civilizations that practiced similar dark rites in ages past. The timing of sacrifice ceremonies follows astronomical and spiritual calendars that identify optimal conditions for maximizing the psychic impact of ritual killings. Solar eclipses, planetary alignments, and anniversaries of significant historical events all provide enhanced opportunities for conducting sacrifices that generate maximum spiritual energy. Many cults maintain detailed astronomical records that enable them to predict optimal sacrifice timing years in advance, allowing for elaborate preparation and victim procurement activities. The disposal of sacrificial remains requires careful consideration to prevent imperial authorities from discovering evidence of cult activities, while ensuring that the spiritual energy released through death continues to benefit the organization. Complete consumption of victims through ritual cannibalism, dissolution in acid baths, or incineration in specially consecrated fires all represent common disposal methods that eliminate physical evidence while maintaining spiritual connections to the deceased. Some cults preserve portions of particularly significant victims as relics that can focus spiritual energy during future ceremonies. Blood offerings extend beyond simple sacrifice to encompass a range of activities involving the voluntary or involuntary contribution of blood by cult members and victims for various ritual purposes. These offerings serve to demonstrate devotion while providing material components for other ceremonial activities, such as the consecration of ritual implements, the creation of protective wards, or the preparation of substances that enhance participants' spiritual sensitivity. The collection and preservation of ritual blood requires specialized knowledge and equipment that ensures the material maintains its spiritual potency over extended periods. Specially prepared vessels, often carved from human skulls or crafted from materials with natural psychic conductivity, serve to store blood offerings while preventing contamination or degradation that could reduce their ceremonial effectiveness. The most sophisticated cults employ preservation techniques derived from forbidden archaeotech or demonic knowledge that maintain blood samples in perfect condition for years or decades. The application of blood offerings in ritual contexts follows elaborate protocols that maximize their spiritual impact while ensuring proper respect for the spiritual essence contained within the material. The painting of blasphemous symbols using sacrificial blood, the anointing of ritual participants with blood from specific types of victims, or the mixing of blood offerings with other ceremonial substances all represent common applications that enhance the effectiveness of cult activities. The voluntary contribution of blood by cult members serves as both a demonstration of devotion and a practical source of material for routine ritual activities. Many cults establish regular schedules for blood collection that ensure adequate supplies while preventing excessive drain on individual members that could compromise their ability to participate in other cult activities. The most dedicated cultists often undergo permanent modifications that facilitate regular blood extraction, including the implantation of collection ports or the surgical alteration of blood vessels to enable easier access. The spiritual significance of blood offerings varies depending on the source, purity, and circumstances surrounding the collection process. Blood freely given by devoted cultists carries different spiritual properties than blood forcibly extracted from unwilling victims, while blood from individuals with specific characteristics such as psychers, nobles, or imperial officials provides enhanced potency for particular types of ritual activities. The most valuable blood offerings come from individuals who possess rare genetic traits, unusual spiritual development, or connections to significant historical events that enhance their psychic resonance. Human sacrifice and blood offerings represent fundamental aspects of chaos worship that serve multiple interconnected purposes within cult organizations, while demonstrating the absolute moral corruption that defines service to the ruinous powers. These practices provide practical benefits, including the generation of psychic energy, the demonstration of devotion, and the psychological conditioning of participants, while serving broader spiritual functions that strengthen the cult's connection to their patron deity and enhance their ability to channel supernatural forces in pursuit of their heretical objectives. The prolonged exposure to chaos energies inevitably transforms those who serve the ruinous powers, marking their bodies and souls with permanent alterations that reflect their spiritual allegiance, while granting enhanced capabilities that exceed normal human limitations. These transformations occur gradually through repeated participation in ritual activities, direct communion with demonic entities, or simple proximity to areas where the warp's influence has saturated the local environment. The nature and extent of these changes vary dramatically depending on the specific chaos power being served, the individual's spiritual receptivity, and the circumstances surrounding their exposure to corrupting influences. The initial stages of chaos-induced transformation typically manifest as subtle alterations that can be easily concealed beneath clothing or dismissed as natural variations in human physiology. A cultist dedicated to Khorne might develop slightly more prominent canine teeth, enhanced muscle definition, or a tendency toward elevated body temperature that reflects their patron's association with violence and bloodshed. Tzeentchian followers often experience changes in eye coloration, the appearance of unusual birthmarks that form geometric patterns, or alterations in their vocal cords that allow them to produce sounds beyond normal human range. Nurgle's influence manifests through seemingly beneficial changes that actually represent the early stages of spiritual corruption and physical decay. Followers might find themselves immune to common diseases, capable of surviving on minimal nutrition, or able to function normally despite injuries that would incapacitate ordinary humans. These apparent improvements mask the gradual breakdown of normal biological processes as the individual's body adapts to accommodate the plague god's gifts of entropy and stagnation. Slaaneshi corruption typically begins with enhancements to sensory perception that allow devotees to experience greater intensity and subtlety in physical sensations, artistic appreciation, and emotional responses. Improved color vision, enhanced tactile sensitivity, or the ability to detect minute variations in sound, taste, or scent all represent common early manifestations of the Dark Prince's influence. These changes initially appear beneficial and may even enhance the individual's performance in their chosen profession or artistic pursuits. The progression of chaos mutations follows patterns that reflect the fundamental nature of each ruinous power, while responding to the specific circumstances and spiritual development of individual cultists. Khornate transformations tend toward enhancements of physical combat capability, with devotees developing natural weapons such as bone spurs, hardened skin that provides armor-like protection, or altered musculature that grants superhuman strength and speed. The most dedicated Khornate cultists eventually develop permanent rage states that eliminate their capacity for complex reasoning while maximizing their effectiveness as instruments of violence. Advanced Khornate mutations often include the development of additional limbs optimized for combat, alterations to the skeletal structure that improve balance and leverage during melee combat, or modifications to the cardiovascular system that allow sustained physical exertion far beyond normal human limits. Some devotees develop the ability to enter berserker frenzies that render them immune to pain and fear, while dramatically increasing their combat effectiveness at the cost of tactical awareness and self-preservation instincts. The most extreme Khornate transformations result in individuals who can no longer function in normal society due to their overwhelming compulsion toward violence and their obvious physical alterations. These beings retain human intelligence, but find themselves incapable of engaging in any activity that does not involve the spilling of blood or the preparation for combat. Their presence alone can trigger violent outbursts among nearby individuals, as their spiritual corruption generates psychic emanations that amplify aggressive impulses in others. Tzeentchian mutations reflect the changer of ways association with knowledge, transformation, and the manipulation of reality through psychic power. Followers often develop enhanced intellectual capabilities, including improved memory, accelerated learning abilities, or intuitive understanding of complex patterns and relationships. Many Tzeentchian cultists manifest minor psychic talents that allow them to perceive future possibilities, influence the thoughts and emotions of others, or manipulate probability in subtle ways that provide advantages in their personal and professional endeavors. Physical alterations among Tzeentchian devotees frequently involve changes that enhance their ability to channel warp energies or perceive supernatural phenomena. Additional eyes that can see across multiple spectrums of light, modifications to the nervous system that improve psychic sensitivity, or alterations to brain structure that expand consciousness beyond normal human limitations all represent common manifestations of the architect of fate's influence. Some cultists develop the ability to perceive multiple potential futures simultaneously, though this gift often comes at the cost of difficulty distinguishing between present reality and possible alternatives. The most advanced Tzeentchian mutations can result in individuals whose physical forms become increasingly unstable as their connection to the warp deepens. These beings might experience spontaneous alterations to their appearance, the ability to phase partially into the Imperium, or constant low-level reality distortions that affect their immediate environment. Their presence can cause electronic equipment to malfunction, written text to change spontaneously, or architectural features to shift and reconfigure without apparent cause. Nurglite transformations embrace decay and entropy as expressions of spiritual truth, with devotees developing the ability to survive and even thrive in conditions that would prove fatal to normal humans. Immunity to disease, toxins, and radiation allows these individuals to operate in environments that remain inaccessible to others, while their altered physiology enables them to draw sustenance from sources that would normally be inedible or harmful. Many Nurglite cultists develop the ability to digest organic matter in any state of decay, allowing them to survive in conditions where conventional food sources are unavailable. The physical changes associated with Nurgle's gifts often include the development of redundant organ systems that provide backup functionality when primary biological processes fail, alterations to skin and muscle tissue that allow continued function despite extensive damage, or modifications to the immune system that transform the individual into a living repository for beneficial diseases. These changes enable Nurglite cultists to serve as carriers and distributors for the plague god's gifts while maintaining their own functionality, despite extensive physical corruption. Advanced Nurglite mutations can result in individuals who have transcended normal biological limitations through the acceptance of entropy as a fundamental principle of existence. These beings might develop the ability to regenerate from seemingly fatal injuries, survive indefinitely without food or water, or exist in states of living decay that would normally be incompatible with consciousness. Their presence often accelerates natural processes of decomposition and decay in their environment, while providing comfort and acceptance to others facing suffering or despair. Slaaneshi mutations pursue the perfection of sensation and experience through modifications that enhance the individual's capacity for pleasure, pain, and aesthetic appreciation. Devotees often develop heightened sensitivity to all forms of stimulation, allowing them to experience ordinary sensations with intensity that approaches transcendent revelation. Enhanced nervous systems, modified sensory organs, or alterations to brain chemistry that amplify emotional responses all represent common manifestations of the Dark Prince's influence. Physical transformations among Slaaneshi cultists frequently focus on the enhancement of beauty, grace, and sensual appeal through modifications that exceed natural human limitations. Improved muscle tone and coordination, enhanced vocal capabilities that allow for superhuman musical performance, or alterations to facial features that create compelling attractiveness all serve to advance the devotee's pursuit of perfection. Many Slaaneshi followers develop pheromone production capabilities that allow them to influence the emotions and desires of others through biochemical manipulation. The most extreme Slaaneshi mutations result in individuals whose pursuit of perfect sensation has transformed them into beings capable of experiencing and providing stimulation beyond normal human comprehension. These creatures might develop additional sensory organs that perceive forms of beauty invisible to ordinary perception, modifications that allow them to induce specific emotional states in others through touch or proximity, or the ability to create artistic works that produce supernatural effects in their audiences. Chaos marks represent the most significant and recognizable signs of divine favor granted to devoted cultists who have demonstrated exceptional service to their chosen ruinous power. These supernatural brands typically appear as permanent alterations to the recipient's flesh that incorporate symbolic elements associated with their patron deity, while providing tangible benefits that enhance their capabilities in service to chaos. The granting of a chaos mark represents a fundamental transformation that permanently binds the recipient to their chosen power, while marking them as valuable servants worthy of continued investment and protection. The Mark of Khorne manifests as a skull-like brand that typically appears on the recipient's forehead, though it may materialize on other prominent locations, depending on the specific circumstances of its granting. This mark provides the bearer with enhanced combat capabilities, including improved reflexes, increased pain tolerance, and the ability to enter controlled berserker states that maximize their effectiveness in melee combat. Recipients of Khorne's mark often find that their presence alone can inspire bloodlust in nearby allies, while causing fear and hesitation among enemies who recognize the significance of their brand. The supernatural properties of Khorne's mark extend beyond simple combat enhancement to include protection against certain forms of psychic attack and the ability to sense the presence of cowards, psychers, and other individuals whom the blood god considers unworthy opponents. Marked Khornate warriors often develop intuitive understanding of combat tactics and weapon use that allows them to master new forms of warfare with minimal training, while their enhanced aggression ensures that they will never retreat from battle, regardless of the odds they face. The Mark of Tzeentch appears as an ever-changing symbol that shifts between different geometric patterns and colors according to the bearer's current activities and spiritual state. This mark grants enhanced intellectual capabilities, including improved memory, accelerated learning, and intuitive understanding of complex systems and relationships. Recipients often develop minor psychic abilities that allow them to perceive hidden connections, influence probability, or access knowledge that exists beyond normal human understanding. The supernatural benefits provided by Tzeentch's mark include protection against mental domination and the ability to see through illusions and deceptions that would fool ordinary individuals. Marked followers of the Changer of Ways often find that they can anticipate their opponent's actions, recognize patterns and opportunities that others miss, and adapt quickly to changing circumstances through their enhanced understanding of cause and effect relationships. The Mark of Nurgle manifests as a diseased area of flesh that displays the symptoms of various plagues, while providing the bearer with immunity to disease, poison, and other forms of biological attack. This mark grants enhanced resilience that allows the recipient to survive injuries and environmental conditions that would prove fatal to normal humans, while their altered physiology enables them to function effectively despite extensive physical damage or decay. Recipients of Nurgle's mark often develop the ability to spread beneficial diseases that provide comfort and acceptance to those suffering from despair, pain, or fear of death. Their presence can accelerate natural healing processes in others who embrace the plague god's philosophy, while their touch can provide relief from suffering through the application of numbing plagues that eliminate pain without causing immediate death. The Mark of Slaanesh appears as an intricate design that incorporates elements of both beauty and corruption, typically manifesting in locations that enhance the bearer's physical attractiveness or artistic capabilities. This mark grants enhanced charisma, improved physical coordination, and heightened sensitivity to all forms of sensation that allows the recipient to experience and provide pleasure beyond normal human limitations. The supernatural properties of Slaanesh's mark include the ability to influence the emotions and desires of others through pheromone production, enhanced vocal capabilities that can induce specific psychological states in listeners, and improved artistic abilities that allow the creation of works capable of producing transcendent experiences in their audiences. Marked followers of the Dark Prince often find that they can inspire devotion, desire, or artistic inspiration in others, while their enhanced sensitivity allows them to appreciate beauty and sensation at levels that approach divine revelation. The process of receiving a Chaos Mark typically requires years of devoted service, combined with exceptional achievements that demonstrate worthiness for such divine recognition. The granting of marks often occurs during moments of extreme spiritual significance, such as major ritual ceremonies, decisive victories against Imperial forces, or successful completion of tasks that advance the patron deity's agenda. The transformation process itself can prove fatal to individuals whose spiritual development is insufficient to accommodate the supernatural energies involved in the marking process. The social implications of bearing visible chaos marks create significant challenges for cultists who must continue operating within Imperial society while concealing evidence of their corruption. Most marked individuals develop elaborate disguise techniques, including the use of cosmetics, clothing, or minor surgical alterations that hide their brands from casual observation. Some cults maintain specialized facilities where marked members can receive medical treatment or cosmetic modification that allows them to maintain their cover identities despite their obvious spiritual corruption. The accumulation of multiple chaos marks represents both the ultimate achievement and greatest danger faced by devoted cultists, as the conflicting energies of different ruinous powers can create unstable spiritual conditions that threaten the recipient's continued existence. Individuals who receive marks from multiple chaos powers often experience accelerated mutation rates, psychological instability, or spontaneous reality distortions that make normal social interaction impossible. The most successful multi-marked cultists learn to balance the competing influences of their various patrons while using their enhanced capabilities to advance the cause of chaos undivided. Spawndom represents the ultimate fate awaiting cultists who accumulate too many mutations, displease their patron deity, or attempt to channel more chaos energy than their physical and spiritual forms can accommodate. This transformation reduces formerly human individuals to mindless beasts driven by basic instincts and random supernatural abilities that make them dangerous to both enemies and allies. The process of spawning typically occurs suddenly and without warning, though experienced cultists learn to recognize the early signs that indicate an individual is approaching this terminal state of corruption. The physical transformation into chaos spawn involves the rapid and uncontrolled manifestation of multiple mutations that reshape the victim's body according to no coherent pattern or design. Limbs might multiply, merge, or disappear entirely, while organs relocate, duplicate, or transform into entirely different biological structures. The resulting creatures retain no resemblance to their original human form and possess no memory of their previous existence, though they may retain fragments of knowledge or skills that manifest as instinctive behaviors or supernatural abilities. Chaos spawn vary dramatically in size, appearance, and capabilities depending on the specific mutations they have accumulated and the circumstances surrounding their transformation. Some spawn develop into massive predatory beasts with multiple heads, natural weapons, and enhanced physical capabilities that make them formidable opponents in combat. Others become smaller, more agile creatures that rely on stealth, speed, or exotic supernatural abilities to survive and hunt. The most unstable spawn continue to mutate throughout their existence, constantly changing form and capabilities in response to environmental stimuli or random warp influences. The psychological state of chaos spawn remains a subject of debate among those scholars brave or foolish enough to study these creatures, as their behavior suggests the complete absence of higher reasoning while occasionally displaying actions that seem to indicate retained memories or learned responses. Most spawn appear driven by basic survival instincts combined with an overwhelming compulsion to seek out and consume sources of chaos energy, leading them to gravitate toward cult activities, ritual sites, or areas where the warp's influence has saturated the local environment. The creation of chaos spawn serves multiple purposes within the broader ecosystem of chaos worship, providing cautionary examples that discourage excessive ambition among cultists while creating useful weapons that can be deployed against enemies or rivals. Experienced cult leaders often maintain collections of spawn that serve as guardians for important facilities, shock troops for military operations, or tools for eliminating threats that require deniable solutions. The unpredictable nature of spawn behavior makes them difficult to control reliably, but their obvious corruption and mindless aggression ensure that they will attack any non-cultist they encounter. The management and utilization of chaos spawn requires specialized knowledge and equipment that allows cultists to direct these creatures toward desired targets while minimizing the risk of accidental attacks on friendly forces. Simple conditioning techniques, the use of pheromone markers that identify allies, or the employment of psychic compulsion can provide limited control over spawn behavior. Some cults develop elaborate training protocols that exploit the creature's residual instincts to create more reliable weapons, though the inherent instability of spawn psychology makes long-term conditioning difficult to maintain. The deployment of chaos spawn in combat operations provides significant advantages, including their immunity to fear, their unpredictable capabilities that make tactical planning difficult for opponents, and their obvious corruption that can demoralize Imperial forces through the psychological impact of facing creatures that represent the ultimate fate of heretics. Spawn prove particularly effective against enemy psychers, as their chaotic spiritual emanations can disrupt psychic abilities, while their resistance to supernatural attacks makes them difficult to eliminate through warp-based powers. The disposal of unwanted or uncontrollable chaos spawn presents ongoing challenges for cult organizations, as these creatures cannot be simply killed and discarded without risking exposure to Imperial authorities. The obvious signs of mutation and corruption displayed by spawn corpses would immediately identify their supernatural origin and trigger extensive investigations that could compromise entire cult networks. Most organizations develop protocols for spawn disposal that involve complete incineration, dissolution in acid, or transportation to remote locations where the creatures can be abandoned without risk of discovery. The study of chaos spawn provides valuable insights into the mechanisms of chaos corruption and the limits of human adaptability to warp influence, though such research requires extreme caution due to the psychological and spiritual dangers involved in prolonged exposure to these creatures. Some Tzeentchian cults maintain detailed records of spawn transformations that document the specific mutations and circumstances that lead to spawning, using this information to better understand the progression of chaos corruption and to identify early warning signs that indicate when cultists are approaching dangerous levels of mutation. The most insidious threat posed by chaos cults lies not in their overt acts of rebellion or demonic summoning, but in their systematic penetration of the very institutions that form the backbone of Imperial civilization. These organizations represent millennia of accumulated authority, infrastructure, and social control that enable the Imperium to maintain order across 1,000,000 worlds. When corruption takes root within these foundational structures, the damage extends far beyond the immediate actions of individual cultists, creating cascading failures that can destabilize entire sectors while providing heretical organizations with access to resources, information, and authority that would otherwise remain forever beyond their reach. The Adeptus Administratum presents perhaps the most attractive target for cult infiltration due to its vast scope, complex bureaucratic procedures, and the natural ambitions of individuals seeking advancement within its labyrinthine hierarchy. The sheer scale of imperial administration creates countless opportunities for corruption to take hold undetected, as the millions of clerks, scribes, and officials who process the Imperium's endless paperwork operate with minimal oversight, while handling information and resources that could prove invaluable to heretical organizations. A single corrupted tax assessor can redirect vast quantities of wealth toward cult activities through subtle manipulation of tithe calculations, while a compromised shipping coordinator can arrange for the transportation of forbidden materials or personnel without triggering security protocols designed to detect such activities. The recruitment of administratum personnel typically begins with the identification of individuals whose personal circumstances or professional frustrations make them vulnerable to alternative approaches to advancement or problem solving. Mid-level bureaucrats who have spent decades processing forms and managing records while watching less competent colleagues receive promotions due to political connections often harbor resentments that can be exploited by patient cult recruiters. These officials possess detailed knowledge of imperial procedures, access to sensitive information, and the authority to make decisions that affect thousands or millions of imperial citizens, making them exceptionally valuable assets for organizations seeking to undermine imperial authority from within. The gradual corruption of administratum officials follows patterns that mirror the broader spiritual seduction employed by chaos cults, beginning with seemingly innocent assistance that addresses legitimate professional or personal concerns. A cult member posing as a helpful colleague might provide information that enables a struggling administrator to resolve persistent problems with their department's budget allocations, or offer connections that facilitate the processing of paperwork that has been delayed by bureaucratic inefficiency. These initial interventions create positive associations with the cult while demonstrating their ability to provide practical benefits that legitimate imperial channels cannot match. The progression from minor rule-bending to outright heretical activity occurs gradually as corrupted officials find themselves increasingly dependent on cult assistance, while simultaneously becoming complicit in activities that place them beyond imperial redemption. An administrator who initially accepts help with legitimate budget problems might gradually be drawn into more sophisticated financial manipulations that divert imperial resources toward cult activities. The psychological pressure created by their growing complicity, combined with the practical benefits of continued cult support, creates powerful incentives for deeper involvement in heretical activities. The compartmentalized nature of imperial administration provides excellent cover for cult activities, as the complex web of overlapping jurisdictions and competing authorities makes it difficult for any single individual to develop a comprehensive understanding of systemic corruption. A cult network might place members in multiple departments within the same administrative complex, allowing them to coordinate their activities while maintaining the appearance of independence. Tax assessment offices, shipping coordinators, personnel departments, and security divisions can all contribute to cult operations through seemingly unrelated activities that combine to create significant advantages for heretical organizations. The most sophisticated administratum infiltrations involve the placement of cult members in positions where they can influence the selection and promotion of other personnel, creating opportunities to gradually increase cult representation within specific departments or facilities. A corrupted personnel director can ensure that cult candidates receive preferential consideration for open positions, while subtly discouraging the advancement of individuals whose loyalty to the Imperium might pose threats to ongoing heretical activities. Over time, these placement strategies can result in entire departments falling under cult control while maintaining the appearance of normal Imperial operation. Planetary defense forces represent another critical infiltration target due to their access to military equipment, training facilities, and strategic intelligence that can prove invaluable for cult military operations. The recruitment of PDF personnel typically focuses on individuals who have become disillusioned with Imperial military doctrine, frustrated by inadequate equipment or training, or embittered by poor treatment from superior officers. These soldiers often possess combat experience, weapons training, and knowledge of Imperial military procedures that make them valuable assets for cult organizations planning armed resistance or terrorist activities. The corruption of PDF units often begins with the introduction of seemingly beneficial modifications to training procedures, equipment maintenance protocols, or tactical doctrines that appear designed to improve unit effectiveness while actually serving cult objectives. A Khornate infiltrator might advocate for more aggressive combat training that emphasizes close quarters fighting and personal combat prowess, gradually conditioning unit members to embrace violence as an end in itself rather than a tool for achieving strategic objectives. Tzeentchian cultists might introduce tactical innovations that require complex coordination and information sharing, creating opportunities to establish communication networks that can be used for heretical purposes. The gradual subversion of military discipline within corrupted PDF units creates conditions that facilitate broader cult recruitment while undermining the effectiveness of Imperial military response to heretical activities. Soldiers who have been conditioned to question orders, pursue personal glory, or prioritize unit loyalty over Imperial doctrine become more susceptible to cult recruitment while simultaneously becoming less reliable as defenders of Imperial authority. The most successful PDF infiltrations result in entire units that maintain the appearance of loyalty while actually serving cult interests through their responses to security threats or military operations. Local government structures provide cult infiltrators with access to political authority, law enforcement resources, and administrative control over civilian populations that can be leveraged to advance heretical objectives while suppressing Imperial resistance. The recruitment of planetary governors, municipal authorities, and other political leaders typically requires more sophisticated approaches than those used with military or administrative personnel, as these individuals often possess greater education, social awareness, and access to resources that could expose cult activities if suspicions are aroused. The corruption of political leaders often involves the gradual introduction of advisors, consultants, or staff members who provide genuinely useful services while slowly introducing perspectives and recommendations that serve cult interests. A Tzeentchian organization might place members in positions as economic advisors who provide valuable insights into trade optimization and resource management, while gradually steering policy decisions toward objectives that benefit cult operations. These infiltrators must demonstrate genuine competence in their assigned roles, while carefully managing the pace and scope of their influence to avoid triggering suspicions about their ultimate loyalties. The subversion of law enforcement agencies represents one of the most critical aspects of cult infiltration, as these organizations possess the authority and capability to investigate and eliminate heretical activities before they can achieve their objectives. The recruitment of arbiters, local security forces, and investigative personnel requires careful attention to the psychological profiles and professional motivations of potential targets, as these individuals typically possess strong loyalty to Imperial authority combined with training designed to detect and resist corruption attempts. The most effective approaches to law enforcement corruption involve the exploitation of legitimate frustrations with bureaucratic limitations, inadequate resources, or political interference that prevents effective law enforcement. A cult recruiter might approach a dedicated investigator who has been frustrated by their inability to prosecute criminals due to political protection or bureaucratic obstacles, offering alternative methods for achieving justice that gradually escalate beyond legal boundaries. The psychological satisfaction derived from successfully eliminating threats to public safety can override moral objections to questionable methods, particularly when the targets are genuinely harmful individuals whose prosecution through legitimate channels has proven impossible. The ecclesiarchy presents unique challenges and opportunities for cult infiltration due to its role as the primary spiritual authority within Imperial society and its extensive network of churches, monasteries, and educational institutions that reach into every level of Imperial civilization. The corruption of religious institutions requires sophisticated theological arguments that can justify heretical practices while maintaining sufficient connection to orthodox Imperial doctrine to avoid immediate detection by ecclesiastical authorities. The recruitment of ecclesiarchy personnel typically begins with the identification of individuals who have encountered theological questions or pastoral challenges that cannot be adequately addressed through orthodox Imperial doctrine. priests who struggle to explain the suffering of innocent populations, theologians who have discovered historical inconsistencies in imperial religious texts, or missionaries who have encountered Xenos philosophies that challenge their understanding of imperial truth, all represent potential targets for cult recruitment efforts. The gradual corruption of religious doctrine follows patterns that exploit genuine theological complexities while introducing alternative interpretations that serve chaos objectives. A Nurgle-like cult might approach priests working in plague-stricken areas with theological frameworks that present suffering as a form of spiritual purification rather than divine punishment, gradually leading them toward acceptance of disease as a blessed state rather than a condition requiring healing. These corrupted teachings often provide more satisfactory explanations for observed phenomena than orthodox doctrine, making them attractive to individuals seeking intellectual and spiritual coherence in their religious understanding. The establishment of heretical interpretations within religious institutions requires careful attention to the pace and scope of doctrinal innovation to avoid triggering investigations by ecclesiastical authorities trained to detect theological deviation. The most successful religious corruption involves the gradual modification of existing practices rather than the introduction of obviously heretical elements, allowing corrupted institutions to maintain their official status while serving cult objectives. Prayer services that incorporate subtle modifications to traditional liturgies, charitable activities that serve as cover for cult recruitment, or educational programs that introduce questionable historical perspectives all represent approaches that can advance heretical objectives while maintaining plausible deniability. The corruption of false prophets represents a particularly insidious form of religious infiltration, as these individuals can leverage genuine spiritual authority and popular devotion to advance cult objectives while maintaining the appearance of orthodox imperial faith. The identification and cultivation of potential false prophets requires extensive knowledge of local religious conditions, popular grievances, and spiritual needs that can be addressed through alternative religious approaches. The development of false prophetic movements typically begins with individuals who possess genuine charisma and spiritual insight, but lack the theological education or institutional support necessary to advance their religious careers through orthodox channels. These individuals often emerge from populations facing genuine hardship or spiritual crisis, making them naturally attractive to desperate populations seeking divine intervention in their circumstances. Cult recruiters can provide these emerging prophets with theological frameworks, material support, and organizational assistance that enables them to build substantial followings while gradually introducing heretical elements into their teachings. The subversion of merchant guilds and trade cartels provides cult organizations with access to vast financial resources, transportation networks, and commercial intelligence that can support heretical activities across multiple star systems. The recruitment of commercial leaders typically focuses on individuals whose business interests have been threatened by imperial regulations, trade restrictions, or competition from politically connected rivals. These merchants often possess extensive knowledge of interplanetary commerce, established relationships with suppliers and customers across multiple worlds, and the financial resources necessary to support large-scale cult operations. The corruption of commercial organizations often begins with offers of assistance that address legitimate business challenges through methods that skirt imperial regulations without obviously violating established law. A cult member with connections to corrupt administratum officials might help a struggling merchant obtain favorable tax assessments or expedited processing for trade permits, creating positive associations with cult assistants while demonstrating their ability to circumvent bureaucratic obstacles that hinder legitimate business activities. The gradual escalation from regulatory circumvention to outright criminal activity follows patterns that mirror other forms of cult corruption, with each successful intervention creating precedents for more serious violations while increasing the merchant's dependence on cult support. A trader who initially accepts help with customs documentation might gradually become involved in smuggling operations that transport cult personnel, forbidden materials, or weapons across Imperial borders. The financial benefits of these illegal activities, combined with the practical impossibility of returning to legitimate commerce after becoming complicit in serious crimes, create powerful incentives for continued cooperation with cult objectives. Industrial complexes represent particularly valuable targets for cult infiltration due to their role in producing the manufactured goods, military equipment, and technological systems that support Imperial civilization. The corruption of factory managers, engineering supervisors, and technical specialists can result in the diversion of production capacity toward cult objectives, while simultaneously undermining the Imperial military's access to reliable equipment and supplies. The recruitment of industrial personnel typically focuses on individuals who possess technical expertise, combined with frustrations about working conditions, advancement opportunities, or the quality of equipment and materials provided by Imperial suppliers. Skilled engineers who have been assigned to manage obsolete equipment, production supervisors who lack the resources necessary to meet their assigned quotas, or technical specialists whose innovations have been ignored by hidebound management all represent potential targets for cult recruitment efforts. The subversion of industrial facilities often involves the gradual introduction of modifications to production processes, quality control procedures, or supply chain management that serve cult objectives while maintaining the appearance of legitimate industrial operation. A corrupted production manager might authorize the manufacture of additional equipment beyond official quotas, with the surplus being diverted to cult stockpiles through falsified shipping records. Quality control supervisors might approve equipment that has been deliberately sabotaged or modified to fail at critical moments, undermining Imperial military effectiveness while providing cult forces with advantages during armed conflicts. Academic institutions provide cult organizations with access to forbidden knowledge, research capabilities, and populations of educated individuals whose intellectual curiosity makes them susceptible to heretical recruitment. The corruption of universities, research facilities, and educational institutions requires sophisticated approaches that can exploit genuine scholarly interests while gradually introducing perspectives and methodologies that serve chaos objectives. The recruitment of academic personnel typically begins with the identification of scholars whose research has encountered questions or problems that cannot be adequately addressed through orthodox Imperial knowledge systems. Historians who have discovered inconsistencies in official Imperial records, archaeologists who have uncovered artifacts that challenge established timelines, or theoretical researchers whose work suggests possibilities that violate Imperial doctrine all represent potential targets for cult recruitment efforts. The gradual corruption of academic research follows patterns that exploit the natural progression of scholarly inquiry while introducing forbidden knowledge sources that provide more satisfactory answers to legitimate questions. A Tzeentchian cult might provide a struggling historian with access to ancient texts that clarify confusing aspects of Imperial history, while gradually introducing materials that challenge fundamental assumptions about the Emperor's nature or the circumstances surrounding the Imperium's founding. These knowledge sources often prove more intellectually satisfying than orthodox alternatives, creating psychological dependence that facilitates deeper involvement in heretical activities. Tech adepts represent particularly valuable targets for cult infiltration due to their access to advanced technology, manufacturing capabilities, and forbidden knowledge that could prove invaluable for cult operations. The recruitment of Mechanicus personnel requires careful attention to their unique psychology and cultural background, as these individuals have undergone extensive conditioning designed to suppress emotional responses and maintain absolute loyalty to the Omnissiah. The corruption of tech adepts often begins with exposure to archaeotech or xenotech that challenges their understanding of orthodox Imperial technology while suggesting possibilities for advancement beyond current Mechanicus doctrine. A tech adept who discovers standard template construct fragments that describe manufacturing processes unknown to current Imperial science, or who encounters Xeno's technology that demonstrates capabilities exceeding Imperial equivalents, may find themselves questioning the completeness of orthodox Mechanicus knowledge. The dangerous allure of forbidden archaeotech represents one of the most significant vulnerabilities faced by technically minded Imperial citizens, as the discovery of advanced technology from humanity's past can provide immediate practical benefits, while gradually exposing the discoverer to corrupting influences that were embedded in the original designs by their creators. Much archaeotech was created during the dark age of technology by human civilizations that had already begun experimenting with warp-based technologies, or had fallen under the influence of chaos entities seeking to corrupt humanity's technological development. The study and utilization of forbidden archaeotech requires extensive technical knowledge combined with spiritual protection that most Imperial citizens lack, making researchers vulnerable to gradual corruption through prolonged exposure to devices that incorporate chaos influences in their fundamental design principles. A tech adept who discovers an archaeotech device that dramatically improves manufacturing efficiency might initially focus on understanding its mechanical principles, while remaining unaware of the subtle psychological influences that gradually alter their thought patterns and spiritual development. Xenotech presents similar dangers combined with additional risks related to exposure to alien thought patterns and technological philosophies that can undermine human psychological stability while introducing concepts that violate fundamental Imperial doctrine about humanity's place in the galaxy. The study of Tau technology exposes researchers to philosophical frameworks that emphasize collective advancement over individual achievement, while Eldar artifacts often incorporate psychic elements that can influence human consciousness in ways that serve alien objectives rather than Imperial interests. The gradual corruption of technical personnel through exposure to forbidden technology follows patterns that exploit natural curiosity and professional ambition, while slowly introducing heretical concepts that reshape the individual's understanding of reality and their place within the Imperial system. The most dangerous forbidden technologies are those that provide genuine benefits or capabilities that exceed Imperial equivalents, as these advantages create practical incentives for continued use despite growing awareness of their corrupting influences. The arsenal of chaos cults extends far beyond conventional weapons and equipment, encompassing a vast collection of cursed artifacts, demon-possessed implements, and forbidden technologies that blur the boundaries between the material and immaterial realms. These items serve not merely as tools of war, but as conduits for the raw power of the warp, each carrying its own malevolent consciousness and demanding terrible prices from those who dare to wield them. The acquisition, maintenance, and deployment of such weapons requires extensive knowledge of both their practical capabilities and the spiritual dangers they present to their users and anyone unfortunate enough to face them in combat. Demon weapons represent the pinnacle of chaos armaments, created through the binding of warp entities into physical forms that can interact directly with the material universe. These weapons possess genuine intelligence and malevolent personality, often displaying preferences for particular types of combat, specific categories of victims, or elaborate methods of killing that satisfy their supernatural hunger for violence and suffering. The creation of demon weapons requires master craftsmen who possess not only exceptional technical skill, but also the spiritual fortitude necessary to survive the binding process and the ongoing relationship with the imprisoned entity. The forging of demon weapons typically begins with the selection of base materials that possess natural affinity for warp energies, including metals that have been exposed to warp storms, alloys created from ore mined on demon worlds, or substances that have absorbed psychic energy through prolonged exposure to battle or ritual activity. The most prized demon weapon materials include steel recovered from the hulks of ships that have traveled through the Eye of Terror, iron extracted from meteorites that originated within warp storms, or precious metals that have been consecrated through the sacrifice of powerful psykers or notable imperial heroes. The binding ritual itself represents one of the most dangerous procedures attempted by chaos cults, requiring the summoning of a demon entity combined with complex binding protocols that force the creature into permanent residence within the weapon's physical structure. The demon must be powerful enough to provide meaningful enhancement to the weapon's capabilities, while remaining weak enough that the binding can be maintained indefinitely without the entity breaking free to possess its wielder or escape into the broader environment. The selection of appropriate demons requires extensive knowledge of warp hierarchies, entity classifications, and the specific characteristics that determine binding compatibility. The psychological relationship between demon weapon wielders and their possessed armaments creates unique challenges that extend far beyond simple weapon maintenance or combat technique. Each demon weapon possesses its own personality, preferences, and agenda that may align with or conflict with its wielder's objectives, creating ongoing negotiations between human ambition and demonic desire. Some demon weapons prove cooperative partners that enhance their wielder's capabilities while providing tactical advice and supernatural insight, while others engage in constant psychological warfare designed to corrupt or dominate their human hosts. The feeding requirements of demon weapons vary dramatically depending on the specific entity bound within the weapon and the circumstances surrounding its creation, but most require regular offerings of blood, souls, or spiritual energy to maintain their supernatural properties. A demon sword might demand the blood of a worthy opponent after each battle, while a possessed bolter could require the sacrifice of innocent civilians to replenish its ammunition with spiritually charged rounds. The failure to satisfy these requirements typically results in the weapon becoming inert or, in extreme cases, turning against its wielder in supernatural fury. The combat capabilities provided by demon weapons exceed those of conventional armaments through combinations of enhanced physical properties and supernatural effects that violate natural law. A demon blade might cut through ceramite armor as easily as flesh, while simultaneously draining the life force of its victims, or a possessed plasma weapon could fire shots that ignore energy shields while seeking their targets with supernatural accuracy. The most powerful demon weapons display adaptive capabilities that allow them to modify their effects based on the specific threats they encounter, developing new abilities in response to enemy defenses or tactical situations. The unpredictable nature of demon weapons creates significant tactical challenges for their wielders, as these items often refuse to function when their services are most desperately needed or provide assistance in ways that serve their own agenda rather than their wielder's immediate objectives. A demon weapon might choose to remain dormant during routine combat, while reserving its power for encounters that promise particularly satisfying opportunities for carnage, or it might deliberately misfire to create more interesting tactical situations that provide greater entertainment for the imprisoned entity. Chaos artifacts recovered from space hulks represent some of the most dangerous and valuable items available to cult organizations, as these ancient vessels often contain relics from civilizations that fell to chaos corruption millennia ago. The exploration of space hulks requires specialized equipment and extensive spiritual protection, as these massive conglomerations of fused spacecraft drift through the warp for centuries or millennia, while accumulating layers of corruption that saturate every surface with malevolent energy. The archaeological teams that venture into these nightmare vessels face constant threats from demon manifestations, reality distortions, and the accumulated psychic residue of countless deaths that occurred during the Hulk's formation. The identification and extraction of valuable artifacts from space hulks requires extensive knowledge of chaos symbology, ancient human technology, and the specific characteristics that distinguish genuinely powerful relics from the countless worthless items that litter these derelict vessels. Experienced artifact hunters learn to recognize the subtle signs that indicate items of true power, including unusual material compositions, persistent energy emanations, or the presence of inscriptions in languages that predate Imperial Gothic. The most valuable space Hulk artifacts often display active supernatural properties that continue to function despite millennia of exposure to warp energies, suggesting either exceptional original craftsmanship or ongoing demonic influence that maintains their operational status. The transportation and storage of recovered chaos artifacts presents ongoing challenges for cult organizations, as these items often continue to emit corrupting influences that can affect nearby personnel or interfere with conventional equipment. Specialized containment procedures typically involve the construction of isolation chambers lined with materials that provide partial protection against warp energies, though complete shielding remains impossible due to the fundamental nature of chaos corruption. The most dangerous artifacts require constant monitoring and regular ritual maintenance to prevent their accumulated energy from reaching critical levels that could trigger spontaneous demon manifestations or reality breaches. Ancient battlefields provide another significant source of chaos artifacts, particularly sites where major conflicts involved extensive use of psychic powers, demonic manifestations, or weapons that incorporated warp-based technologies. The psychic residue generated by mass casualties, combined with the spiritual energy released through acts of extreme violence or desperation, creates conditions where ordinary objects can spontaneously develop supernatural properties through prolonged exposure to concentrated emotional trauma. Weapons that absorb the final thoughts of dying warriors, armor pieces that witnessed acts of exceptional heroism or cowardice, or personal items that carried the hopes and fears of their owners through their final moments all represent potential sources of powerful artifacts. The excavation of ancient battlefields requires careful attention to both archaeological methodology and spiritual protection, as the disturbing of sites where massive trauma occurred can trigger psychic phenomena that threaten the sanity and safety of excavation teams. Experienced artifact hunters employ combinations of conventional archaeological techniques with ritual procedures designed to appease the restless spirits that often inhabit such locations, offering prayers, sacrifices, or other forms of spiritual compensation for the disruption of their eternal rest. The most successful battlefield excavations involve extensive preliminary research that identifies specific locations where significant events occurred, allowing teams to focus their efforts on areas most likely to contain items of genuine power. Pre-imperial human civilizations that fell to chaos corruption during the Age of Strife left behind vast quantities of artifacts that combine advanced technological capabilities with deep spiritual contamination accumulated through centuries of heretical worship. These items often display technological sophistication that exceeds current imperial capabilities, while incorporating design elements that violate fundamental principles of orthodox imperial technology. The study of such artifacts provides valuable insights into alternative approaches to technological development, while exposing researchers to corrupting influences that gradually undermine their loyalty to imperial doctrine. The most dangerous pre-imperial artifacts are those that were created specifically for ritual purposes by civilizations that had achieved deep understanding of warp manipulation and demon summoning. These items often incorporate living components, self-modifying materials, or consciousness transfer technologies that allow them to adapt and evolve in response to their environment, while maintaining active connections to entities that exist within the Imperium. The activation of such artifacts can trigger effects that extend far beyond their immediate location, potentially affecting entire planetary populations or creating permanent alterations to local reality that persist for generations. Corrupted imperial technology represents a particularly insidious category of chaos artifacts, as these items maintain the appearance and basic functionality of orthodox imperial equipment while incorporating modifications that serve heretical purposes. The corruption of Imperial technology typically occurs through prolonged exposure to warp energies, deliberate modification by dark mechanicus tech adepts, or the influence of demon entities that have learned to inhabit and manipulate mechanical systems. These corrupted devices often prove more reliable and effective than their orthodox equivalents, creating practical incentives for their adoption despite the spiritual dangers they represent. The identification of corrupted Imperial technology requires extensive technical knowledge combined with spiritual sensitivity that can detect the subtle signs of chaos influence that may not be immediately apparent through conventional analysis. Experienced tech adepts learn to recognize anomalous power consumption patterns, unusual material compositions, or operational characteristics that exceed normal Imperial specifications as potential indicators of corruption. The most sophisticated corrupted technologies incorporate self-concealment features that hide their true nature from casual inspection, while revealing their enhanced capabilities only to users who demonstrate appropriate spiritual corruption or knowledge of activation procedures. Dark Mechanicus innovations represent the cutting edge of corrupted Imperial technology, created by tech adepts who have abandoned orthodox Mechanicus doctrine in favor of research approaches that incorporate forbidden knowledge and warp-based enhancement techniques. These innovations often achieve dramatic improvements in performance, efficiency, or capability through the integration of daemonic entities, Xenos technology, or theoretical principles that violate fundamental Imperial scientific doctrine. The development of Dark Mechanicus technology requires not only exceptional technical skill, but also extensive spiritual corruption that enables researchers to survive direct exposure to the warp energies that power their creations. The manufacturing processes employed by Dark Mechanicus forge cults incorporate ritual elements that consecrate their products to specific chaos powers, while embedding spiritual components that enhance the technology's connection to warp energies. These procedures typically involve the use of human sacrifice, demonic summoning, or exposure to concentrated chaos corruption during critical manufacturing phases, creating products that possess supernatural properties alongside their enhanced technical capabilities. The resulting devices often display adaptive behaviors, self-repair capabilities, or the ability to evolve new functions in response to their operational environment. The distribution networks that supply corrupted technology to chaos cults operate through complex webs of intermediaries, black market dealers, and corrupted Imperial officials who provide plausible explanations for the acquisition and deployment of obviously non-standard equipment. These networks often exploit legitimate salvage operations, archaeological expeditions, or military surplus disposal programs to introduce corrupted items into general circulation while maintaining sufficient documentation to satisfy casual Imperial scrutiny. The most sophisticated distribution operations involve the gradual replacement of standard Imperial equipment with corrupted alternatives that provide superior performance while slowly conditioning their users to accept increasingly obvious violations of orthodox Imperial doctrine. Ritual implements serve as focal points for cult ceremonies while providing practical tools that enhance the effectiveness of supernatural activities through their design, materials, and accumulated spiritual energy. These items range from simple ceremonial daggers and offering bowls to elaborate altar systems and summoning apparatus that require teams of specialists to operate safely. The creation of effective ritual implements requires knowledge of sacred geometry, materials science, and spiritual principles that determine how physical objects can channel and focus warp energies according to the requirements of specific ceremonial procedures. The consecration of ritual implements involves elaborate ceremonies that imbue ordinary objects with spiritual significance, while establishing connections to specific chaos powers or demon entities that enhance their ceremonial effectiveness. These consecration rituals typically involve the application of sacrificial blood, exposure to concentrated warp energy, or the performance of specific prayers and incantations that invoke the attention and blessing of supernatural entities. The most powerful ritual implements undergo multiple consecration ceremonies over extended periods, gradually accumulating spiritual energy that enhances their ability to channel supernatural forces during cult activities. Cursed tomes represent repositories of forbidden knowledge that serve simultaneously as reference materials, spiritual focal points, and active sources of corruption that gradually influence anyone who studies their contents. These books typically contain combinations of historical information, theoretical frameworks, ritual instructions, and philosophical arguments that challenge orthodox imperial doctrine while providing alternative explanations for observed phenomena. The creation of cursed tomes requires not only extensive knowledge of heretical subjects, but also the ability to imbue written text with spiritual energy that affects readers on psychological and supernatural levels. The binding and preservation of cursed tomes involves specialized techniques that protect their contents from physical decay while maintaining the spiritual potency of their corrupting influence. Many such books are bound in human skin, written with ink created from sacrificial blood, or illustrated with images that incorporate psychoactive pigments derived from warp-touched materials. The most dangerous cursed tomes display active properties that include self-modification of their contents, the ability to influence nearby individuals even when closed, or the manifestation of demon entities that serve as guardians or interpreters of their forbidden knowledge. The study of cursed tomes requires extensive spiritual protection combined with careful attention to the psychological effects that prolonged exposure to heretical knowledge can produce in even the most dedicated imperial servants. Readers often experience gradual changes in their thought patterns, moral frameworks, and spiritual allegiances that reflect the corrupting influence of the forbidden information they are absorbing. The most insidious cursed tomes present their heretical content through logical arguments and compelling evidence that gradually undermines the reader's faith in imperial doctrine, while providing alternative belief systems that seem more intellectually satisfying or emotionally appealing. Relics that serve as focal points for chaotic energies encompass a vast category of objects that have acquired supernatural properties through association with significant events, prolonged exposure to warp influence, or deliberate consecration to specific chaos powers. These items often appear unremarkable to casual observation, while possessing powerful abilities that manifest only under specific conditions, or when activated by individuals who possess appropriate knowledge or spiritual development. The identification and utilization of such relics requires extensive experience with chaos artifacts combined with intuitive understanding of the subtle signs that indicate genuine supernatural potency. The activation of chaos relics typically requires specific procedures that may involve ritual preparation, the application of particular substances, or the recitation of activation phrases that serve as keys to unlock the item's supernatural properties. These activation requirements often reflect the original circumstances surrounding the relic's creation or consecration, requiring users to recreate historical conditions or demonstrate understanding of the spiritual principles that govern the item's function. The most powerful relics demand ongoing tribute or maintenance that ensures their continued effectiveness, while binding their users into relationships that gradually increase their spiritual corruption and dependence on the relic's supernatural assistance. The Imperium's response to the ever-present threat of chaos corruption represents one of the most complex and resource-intensive operations undertaken by imperial institutions, requiring coordination between multiple organizations whose methods, priorities, and operational doctrines often conflict with each other. The detection and elimination of heretical cults demands not only military force, but also sophisticated intelligence gathering, theological expertise, and the willingness to make terrible sacrifices that preserve the broader imperial population at the cost of individual worlds, systems, or even entire sectors. The scale and persistence of chaos infiltration throughout Imperial society ensures that this struggle remains constant, with new threats emerging even as existing ones are eliminated through the application of overwhelming force or surgical precision. The Ordo Malleus stands as the Imperium's primary weapon against demonic incursions and the chaos cults that facilitate such manifestations, operating with authority that transcends normal Imperial hierarchies while maintaining access to resources and knowledge that remain forbidden to other Imperial institutions. Inquisitors of the Ordo Malleus undergo specialized training that encompasses not only conventional investigative techniques, but also extensive education in demonology, warp theory, and the specific methodologies required to combat supernatural threats without succumbing to the corrupting influences they seek to eliminate. Their expertise extends beyond simple recognition of chaos symbols or ritual practices to include deep understanding of the psychological, spiritual, and material conditions that enable cult formation and growth within Imperial society. The knowledge base maintained by the Ordo Malleus encompasses centuries of accumulated experience in combating chaos threats, documented through detailed case studies, theoretical analyses, and practical guidelines that enable inquisitors to recognize patterns and predict cult behavior across diverse operational environments. This institutional memory includes comprehensive databases of known chaos symbols, ritual practices, recruitment techniques, and organizational structures that provide starting points for investigations, while highlighting the specific indicators that distinguish genuine heretical activity from innocuous civilian behavior or legitimate religious practices. The most experienced Malleus inquisitors develop intuitive understanding of cult psychology that allows them to anticipate heretical strategies and counter moves, though such expertise requires years of direct exposure to chaos corruption that inevitably leaves permanent marks on their psyche and spiritual development. The specialized equipment employed by Ordo Malleus operatives reflects their unique operational requirements, incorporating both advanced Imperial technology and carefully controlled applications of forbidden knowledge that enable them to combat supernatural threats on equal terms. Consecrated weapons, blessed by the most senior ecclesiarchy authorities, provide enhanced effectiveness against demonic entities, while offering some protection against the corrupting influences that emanate from prolonged contact with chaos artifacts or possessed individuals. Psychic hoods, null fields, and other protective devices shield inquisitors from the worst effects of warp exposure, while allowing them to operate in environments where normal humans would quickly succumb to madness or spiritual corruption. The detection protocols developed by the Ordo Malleus combine conventional investigative techniques with specialized procedures designed to identify the subtle signs of chaos corruption that often precede overt cult activity by months or years. These methods include analysis of statistical anomalies in crime rates, disease patterns, or administrative efficiency that might indicate supernatural influence, combined with direct psychic scanning of suspected individuals or locations using sanctioned psychers trained specifically for counter-chaos operations. The most sophisticated detection systems incorporate automated monitoring of communication networks, financial transactions, and shipping manifests that can identify patterns consistent with cult resource acquisition or coordination activities. Inquisitorial investigation methods employed against chaos cults must balance the need for thorough intelligence gathering against the spiritual dangers posed by prolonged exposure to heretical influence, requiring careful management of personnel exposure while ensuring that investigations remain sufficiently comprehensive to identify all aspects of cult operations. The compartmentalized nature of most cult organizations demands patient surveillance and infiltration efforts that can span years or decades, gradually mapping organizational structures and identifying key personnel, while avoiding premature action that could allow important cult members to escape or activate contingency plans that might include demonic summoning or terrorist attacks. The interrogation techniques employed by Ordo Malleus personnel incorporate both conventional methods and specialized procedures designed to extract information from individuals who may be under demonic influence or whose memories have been altered through exposure to warp energies. Standard interrogation protocols prove inadequate when dealing with cultists whose spiritual corruption has fundamentally altered their psychological makeup, requiring the use of psychic interrogation, chemical enhancement, or even limited applications of controlled chaos exposure that can break through supernatural mental barriers. The most dangerous interrogations involve captured cult leaders or demon-possessed individuals whose knowledge could provide crucial intelligence about broader heretical networks, though such procedures carry significant risks for both interrogators and subjects. The deployment of sanctioned psychers in anti-chaos operations represents one of the most controversial and dangerous aspects of inquisitorial methodology, as these individuals possess the psychic sensitivity necessary to detect supernatural threats while remaining vulnerable to the very influences they are employed to combat. Astropaths trained specifically for Malleus operations undergo additional conditioning designed to strengthen their resistance to chaos corruption, while enhancing their ability to perceive demonic activity or cult ritual practices. These specialized psychers often serve as early warning systems that can detect the psychic disturbances generated by major cult ceremonies or demon summoning attempts, providing inquisitorial forces with advance notice of impending supernatural manifestations. Battle psychers assigned to Ordo Malleus strike teams receive extensive training in combat applications of their abilities, specifically tailored for engagement with demonic entities and corrupted humans, learning techniques that can disrupt chaos rituals, banish lesser demons, or provide psychic protection for conventional Imperial forces operating in areas of high warp activity. The most experienced Malleus psychers develop specialized abilities that include the detection of possessed individuals, the identification of chaos artifacts, or the ability to trace psychic emanations back to their sources across vast distances. However, the constant exposure to chaos corruption inherent in such operations ensures that these individuals face significantly higher rates of madness, possession, or spiritual corruption compared to psychers assigned to other Imperial duties. The coordination between Ordo Malleus operations and conventional Imperial forces requires careful management of information security while ensuring that military units receive sufficient intelligence to operate effectively against supernatural threats they may not fully understand. Most Imperial Guard regiments lack the training or equipment necessary to combat demon manifestations or heavily corrupted cultists, requiring inquisitorial forces to provide specialized support while maintaining operational security that prevents sensitive information about chaos capabilities from spreading beyond authorized personnel. The most successful joint operations involve extensive preparation that includes briefings on expected threat types, distribution of consecrated weapons and protective equipment, and the assignment of inquisitorial liaisons who can provide real-time guidance during combat operations. The Adeptus Archives serve as the Imperium's most dedicated and effective force for the elimination of heretical cults, combining unwavering faith in the Emperor with military training, specifically designed for close-quarters combat against corrupted humans and lesser demonic entities. The Battle Sisters' absolute spiritual purity provides natural resistance to chaos corruption, while their extensive training in anti-heretic warfare enables them to identify and eliminate cult activities with precision that minimizes collateral damage to innocent Imperial citizens. Their role extends beyond simple military action to encompass the spiritual cleansing of contaminated areas and the restoration of proper Imperial faith among populations that have been exposed to heretical influence. The faith-based warfare techniques employed by the Adeptus Archives incorporate both practical combat skills and spiritual practices that enhance their effectiveness against supernatural threats, while providing protection against the corrupting influences they encounter during anti-cult operations. The recitation of litanies and prayers during combat serves not merely as spiritual comfort, but as active protection against demonic influence, creating psychic barriers that can disrupt chaos rituals or weaken the manifestation of warp entities. The most experienced battle sisters develop intuitive understanding of chaos corruption that allows them to identify possessed individuals, detect the presence of demon artifacts, or recognize the early signs of cult activity within civilian populations. The purification protocols employed by Sororita's forces following successful anti-cult operations involve systematic cleansing of contaminated areas using combinations of physical destruction, chemical treatment, and spiritual consecration designed to eliminate any residual chaos influence that might facilitate future heretical activity. These procedures typically include the complete incineration of cult facilities, the destruction of any materials that may have been exposed to ritual activity, and the performance of extensive blessing ceremonies that reconsecrate contaminated ground to the Emperor's service. The most thorough purification operations involve the replacement of contaminated soil, the reconstruction of buildings using blessed materials, and the establishment of permanent shrines that provide ongoing spiritual protection against future chaos incursion. The psychological warfare capabilities of the Adeptus Archives prove particularly effective against cult organizations, whose membership includes individuals who retain some degree of loyalty to imperial authority or whose corruption remains incomplete. The visible presence of battle sisters conducting anti-heretic operations often triggers mass defections from cult organizations, as wavering members recognize the futility of opposing the Emperor's chosen warriors. The Sororita's reputation for mercy toward repentant heretics, combined with their absolute ruthlessness against unrepentant cultists, creates psychological pressure that can cause cult organizations to collapse through internal defections before military action becomes necessary. The specialized equipment employed by battle sisters in anti-cult operations includes weapons and protective gear specifically consecrated for use against chaos threats, incorporating blessed materials and sacred symbols that enhance their effectiveness while providing spiritual protection for their wielders. Flamers loaded with blessed promethium prove particularly effective against demon-possessed individuals or cult artifacts that might resist conventional weapons, while power armor inscribed with protective wards provides enhanced resistance to psychic attacks or supernatural corruption. The most elite Sororitas units employ relic weapons recovered from previous anti-chaos campaigns, including blades that have been blessed through contact with Imperial saints or firearms that have been consecrated through use in notable victories against heretical forces. The intelligence-gathering capabilities of Adeptus Sororitas forces complement their combat effectiveness through extensive networks of contacts within civilian populations, ecclesiarchy institutions, and other imperial organizations that can provide early warning of cult activity or heretical influence. Battle sisters often serve as informal spiritual counselors for imperial citizens facing personal crises that might make them vulnerable to cult recruitment, providing guidance and support that addresses the underlying conditions that enable heretical organizations to gain footholds within imperial society. The most experienced Sororitas develop deep understanding of local social conditions, religious practices, and cultural traditions that enable them to distinguish between legitimate expressions of imperial faith and subtle deviations that might indicate early-stage cult infiltration. The coordination between Adeptus Sororitas forces and local imperial authorities requires careful attention to jurisdictional boundaries, while ensuring that anti-cult operations receive necessary support from planetary governments, law enforcement agencies, and military units. Battle Sisters often serve as advisors to local officials who lack experience in dealing with supernatural threats, providing guidance on security procedures, identification techniques, and response protocols that can prevent cult activities from escalating to levels that require major military intervention. The most successful cooperative operations involve extensive preparation that includes training programs for local personnel, establishment of communication protocols that ensure rapid response to emerging threats, and the development of contingency plans that can be implemented if cult activities exceed local response capabilities. Planetary quarantine protocols represent one of the most drastic measures available to Imperial authorities when chaos corruption has spread beyond the capabilities of conventional counter-cult operations, involving the complete isolation of affected worlds, while specialized forces attempt to eliminate heretical influence or assess the feasibility of planetary recovery. The implementation of quarantine requires authorization from the highest levels of Imperial authority and involves massive resource commitments that include the deployment of naval forces sufficient to prevent any escape from the quarantine system, the establishment of monitoring stations that can detect any attempt to breach the isolation barrier, and the preparation of military forces capable of implementing more extreme measures if containment efforts prove unsuccessful. The criteria for implementing planetary quarantine reflect the severity of chaos corruption and the assessed probability of successful containment or elimination of heretical influence through conventional means. Worlds experiencing widespread demon manifestations, systematic corruption of planetary government, or the emergence of self-sustaining cult networks that have achieved effective control over significant portions of the population typically qualify for quarantine status. The decision-making process involves detailed analysis of intelligence reports, assessment of available military resources, and evaluation of strategic importance that determines whether quarantine represents a viable alternative to more extreme measures. The operational procedures governing quarantined worlds involve strict protocols that prevent any contact between affected populations and the broader Imperium, while maintaining surveillance capabilities that enable Imperial authorities to monitor the progression of chaos corruption and assess the effectiveness of containment measures. Naval patrols equipped with long-range sensors maintain constant vigilance against any attempt by corrupted populations to escape their isolation, while automated monitoring systems track communication attempts, spacecraft launches, or other activities that might indicate organized efforts to spread corruption beyond the quarantine system. The most sophisticated quarantine operations include the deployment of specialized research teams that study the progression of chaos corruption under controlled conditions, gathering intelligence that can improve future counter-cult operations while maintaining strict isolation protocols that prevent any contamination of research personnel. The duration of planetary quarantine varies dramatically depending on the specific nature of chaos corruption and the assessed probability of successful recovery through natural processes or limited intervention. Some quarantined worlds experience gradual reduction in cult activity as heretical organizations collapse due to internal conflicts, resource depletion, or the natural consequences of their spiritual corruption, eventually reaching states where limited Imperial intervention might restore normal governance. Others experience accelerating corruption that transforms entire planetary populations into demon-possessed horrors or triggers reality distortions that make the world uninhabitable by normal human standards. Exterminatus orders represent the ultimate expression of Imperial determination to prevent chaos corruption from spreading beyond containment, involving the complete destruction of planetary biospheres through the application of weapons systems capable of eliminating all life while rendering affected worlds permanently uninhabitable. The authorization of Exterminatus requires the highest levels of Imperial approval and involves detailed analysis of strategic considerations, resource requirements, and long-term consequences that extend far beyond the immediate military objectives. The psychological impact of exterminatus operations on Imperial personnel and civilian populations requires careful management to prevent the development of defeatist attitudes or questioning of Imperial authority that could create vulnerabilities for future chaos infiltration. The technical implementation of exterminatus operations employs various weapon systems designed to achieve complete planetary sterilization through different mechanisms that reflect available resources, strategic requirements, and the specific nature of threats being eliminated. Cyclonic torpedoes provide rapid atmospheric ignition that creates planet-wide firestorms capable of eliminating all surface life within hours, while virus bombing involves the deployment of biological agents that consume all organic matter before self-destructing to prevent uncontrolled spread. The most extreme exterminatus operations employ weapons that can crack planetary crusts or trigger stellar instabilities that eliminate entire star systems, though such measures require extraordinary authorization and involve consequences that affect multiple worlds and billions of Imperial citizens. The terrible calculus of acceptable losses that governs Imperial decision-making regarding chaos threats reflects the fundamental reality that the survival of human civilization requires the willingness to sacrifice individual worlds, systems, or even entire sectors to prevent corruption from achieving levels that could threaten the Imperium as a whole. The mathematical models employed by Imperial strategists incorporate assessments of corruption spread rates, resource requirements for containment operations, and probability calculations that determine the point at which preservation efforts become counterproductive compared to elimination and replacement strategies. These calculations must account for factors including the strategic value of affected territories, the availability of military resources for containment operations, and the potential consequences of allowing chaos corruption to spread to neighboring systems or critical Imperial infrastructure. The psychological burden carried by Imperial commanders who must authorize such extreme measures requires extensive spiritual preparation and ongoing support that enables them to maintain their effectiveness while processing the emotional consequences of decisions that result in the deaths of billions of Imperial citizens. The most experienced commanders develop philosophical frameworks that emphasize their role as guardians of human civilization rather than destroyers of individual worlds, focusing on the countless lives saved through their willingness to make impossible choices rather than dwelling on the immediate casualties their decisions create. The Imperium's institutional support systems include specialized counseling services, spiritual guidance programs, and rotation policies that prevent individual commanders from bearing the psychological burden of multiple exterminatus authorizations without adequate recovery time. The long-term strategic implications of exterminatus operations extend far beyond the immediate elimination of chaos threats to include the permanent loss of productive worlds, the psychological impact on surviving populations, and the creation of dead zones that may require centuries or millennia to recover sufficiently for recolonization. The replacement of destroyed worlds through the identification and development of new colonies involves massive resource investments and extended timelines that constrain Imperial capabilities while creating temporary vulnerabilities in affected sectors. The most comprehensive post-exterminatus recovery programs include the establishment of monitoring stations that track the long-term effects of planetary destruction, research initiatives that study methods for accelerating environmental recovery, and colonization planning that identifies suitable replacement worlds for future development. The annals of Imperial history bear witness to countless heretical uprisings that have tested the Imperium's resolve and demonstrated the persistent threat posed by organized chaos worship. Among these dark episodes, certain cult movements stand out for their scale, sophistication, or the lasting impact they inflicted upon Imperial civilization. These notable organizations provide crucial insights into the evolution of heretical tactics, while serving as sobering reminders of the consequences that await when corruption achieves sufficient momentum to challenge imperial authority directly. The Plague of Unbelief represents one of the most catastrophic failures of imperial spiritual authority in recorded history, emerging during the 36th millennium when systemic corruption within the ecclesiarchy created conditions that enabled heretical movements to flourish across hundreds of worlds. The crisis began with legitimate grievances against ecclesiastical authorities who had abandoned their spiritual duties in favor of political maneuvering and personal enrichment, creating a vacuum of moral leadership that heretical preachers eagerly filled with alternative doctrines promising spiritual fulfillment and temporal justice. The corruption within the ecclesiarchy during this period reached levels that shocked even hardened imperial observers, with high-ranking clergy openly engaging in activities that violated fundamental imperial doctrine while using their religious authority to shield themselves from legitimate criticism or investigation. Cardinals maintained private armies that enforced their will through violence rather than spiritual guidance, while bishops accumulated vast personal fortunes through the sale of religious offices and the diversion of charitable donations intended for the relief of suffering populations. The most egregious examples included the transformation of sacred shrines into personal pleasure palaces, the use of ecclesiarchy resources to fund private wars between competing religious factions, and the systematic suppression of genuine spiritual inquiry in favor of dogmatic adherence to politically convenient interpretations of imperial doctrine. The emergence of Sebastian Thor as a reformist leader initially appeared to offer hope for the restoration of legitimate religious authority within the Imperium, as his early teachings emphasized a return to the fundamental principles of imperial faith while addressing the practical concerns that had driven many citizens toward heretical alternatives. Thor's movement attracted support from across imperial society, including disillusioned clergy who sought to restore their institution's spiritual credibility, military officers frustrated by the ecclesiarchy's interference in legitimate security operations, and civilian populations desperate for religious leadership that addressed their genuine spiritual needs rather than serving narrow political interests. The theological framework developed by Sebastian Thor's movement incorporated elements that challenged established ecclesiarchy doctrine while remaining within the bounds of orthodox imperial faith, creating space for religious innovation that addressed contemporary spiritual needs without abandoning fundamental loyalty to the emperor. Thor's teachings emphasized personal spiritual development over institutional authority, encouraged direct communion with the emperor's divine essence rather than reliance on ecclesiastical intermediaries, and promoted practical expressions of faith through service to imperial society rather than passive acceptance of clerical pronouncements. These innovations attracted followers who had become alienated from traditional religious institutions, while providing theological justification for resistance to corrupt ecclesiastical authority. The military campaigns that accompanied Thor's reform movement involved complex political and religious considerations that extended far beyond simple armed conflict, as loyalist imperial forces found themselves caught between their duty to maintain order and their recognition that the existing ecclesiarchy had become a threat to imperial stability. Many imperial guard regiments faced the difficult choice between supporting corrupt religious authorities who possessed legitimate institutional power or backing reform movements that challenged established hierarchies despite offering more credible spiritual leadership. The most successful Thorian military operations were those that managed to present themselves as defenders of true imperial faith against heretical corruption rather than rebels against legitimate authority. The eventual success of Sebastian Thor's reform movement required not only military victory over corrupt ecclesiastical forces, but also the construction of new institutional frameworks that could prevent the recurrence of similar corruption while maintaining the spiritual authority necessary for effective religious leadership. The reformed ecclesiarchy that emerged from this crisis incorporated checks and balances designed to prevent the concentration of excessive power in individual religious leaders, while establishing oversight mechanisms that could detect and eliminate corruption before it reached systemic levels. These institutional innovations included the creation of independent audit bodies that monitored ecclesiastical finances, the establishment of term limits for major religious offices, and the development of procedures that enabled the removal of corrupt clergy through formal review processes rather than political maneuvering. The long-term consequences of the plague of unbelief extended far beyond the immediate religious reforms implemented by Sebastian Thor's movement, creating precedents for legitimate resistance to corrupt imperial institutions, while simultaneously demonstrating the dangers posed when such resistance movements lack adequate spiritual protection against chaos infiltration. Many of the theological innovations introduced during this period created intellectual frameworks that could be exploited by heretical movements seeking to justify their opposition to imperial authority, while the precedent of successful resistance to established religious hierarchy provided inspiration for future cult leaders who claimed similar justification for their rebellious activities. The Apostles of the Blind King emerged during the Gothic War as one of the most sophisticated heretical organizations to achieve operational coordination with Abaddon's 12th Black Crusade, demonstrating the potential for chaos cults to serve as force multipliers that enhance the effectiveness of major military campaigns through their access to imperial infrastructure and intelligence networks. This cult organization distinguished itself through its remarkable ability to maintain operational security while coordinating activities across multiple star systems, suggesting leadership capabilities and organizational sophistication that exceeded most heretical movements encountered by imperial forces during this period. The theological framework employed by the Apostles of the Blind King incorporated elements derived from ancient human religions that predated imperial conquest, combined with chaos doctrine that emphasized the inevitability of change and the futility of resistance to superior spiritual forces. The cult's leadership claimed that their blind king represented a prophetic figure whose spiritual blindness enabled him to perceive truths that remained hidden from those whose vision was corrupted by loyalty to false imperial ideals. This theological approach proved particularly effective in recruiting individuals who had become disillusioned with imperial authority due to personal experiences of injustice, administrative incompetence, or military failure that suggested fundamental flaws in imperial civilization. The cult's recruitment strategies focused heavily on Imperial Navy personnel and civilian populations involved in interstellar commerce, taking advantage of the Gothic sector's role as a major trade hub to establish networks that could operate across multiple worlds while maintaining legitimate cover identities. Merchant captains provided transportation for cult personnel and materials, while naval officers supplied intelligence about imperial fleet movements and defensive preparations. The most valuable recruits included astropaths who could facilitate secure communication between cult cells, navigators whose knowledge of warp routes enabled the coordination of cult activities with chaos fleet movements, and technical specialists who could sabotage imperial equipment or modify it to serve heretical purposes. The coordination between the Apostles of the Blind King and Abaddon's military forces represented a sophisticated example of combined operations that leveraged the unique capabilities of both conventional Chaos Space Marine forces and infiltrated cult networks to achieve strategic objectives that neither could have accomplished independently. The cult provided advanced intelligence about Imperial defensive preparations, conducted sabotage operations that weakened key Imperial installations before Chaos Fleet arrivals, and coordinated uprisings timed to coincide with major Chaos offensives. These activities proved particularly effective during the assault on Blackstone Fortress installations, where cult infiltrators disabled critical defensive systems and eliminated key personnel whose expertise was essential for effective fortress operation. The cult's most significant contribution to the Gothic War involved their infiltration of Imperial Navy communication networks, which enabled them to intercept and decrypt strategic communications while feeding false information to Imperial commanders that contributed to several major tactical defeats. The cult's technical specialists, many of whom had been recruited from Imperial Navy communication departments, possessed detailed knowledge of encryption protocols and communication procedures that allowed them to conduct sophisticated information warfare operations. These activities included the transmission of false fleet movement orders that dispersed Imperial forces at critical moments, the interception of supply convoy routes that enabled Chaos forces to conduct devastating ambush operations, and the coordination of simultaneous attacks on multiple Imperial installations that overwhelmed local defensive capabilities. The eventual exposure and elimination of the Apostles of the Blind King required extensive cooperation between inquisitorial forces and Imperial Navy intelligence services, as the cult's deep penetration of Imperial institutions made conventional counterintelligence operations inadequate for identifying and eliminating all cult members. The investigation revealed the extent to which the cult had compromised Imperial operations throughout the Gothic sector, with evidence suggesting that cult influence had contributed to Imperial defeats and casualties far exceeding what had been attributed to conventional Chaos military superiority. The purges that followed the cult's exposure resulted in the execution or imprisonment of thousands of Imperial personnel, creating temporary disruptions in Imperial operations that required months to resolve through the training and deployment of replacement personnel. The tech heresy cults of Hydra Cordatus represented a particularly dangerous form of Chaos corruption that combined advanced technological capabilities with deep spiritual allegiance to the ruinous powers, creating organizations capable of producing weapons and equipment that rivaled or exceeded Imperial equivalents while serving the broader strategic objectives of Chaos forces throughout the galaxy. These cults emerged from the corrupted remnants of Forge worlds that had fallen to Iron Warriors' influence during various campaigns, with surviving tech adepts embracing heretical interpretations of the Omnissiah that incorporated Chaos doctrine while retaining their technical expertise and manufacturing capabilities. The Iron Warriors' approach to cult cultivation differed significantly from methods employed by other Chaos Space Marine legions, emphasizing practical utility and technological innovation over purely spiritual considerations. The Legion's leadership recognized that corrupted Forge worlds could provide manufacturing capabilities that would enhance their military effectiveness while creating sustainable sources of advanced equipment that could support extended campaigns without reliance on captured Imperial materiel. This strategic vision required careful management of corrupted tech adept populations to ensure that their heretical spiritual development did not interfere with their continued ability to produce useful technological innovations. The corruption process employed by Iron Warriors forces typically began with the identification of Forge worlds whose strategic location, manufacturing capabilities, or research facilities made them valuable targets for long-term exploitation rather than simple destruction. The Legion's approach involved gradual infiltration of tech adept hierarchies through the introduction of seemingly beneficial technological innovations that incorporated subtle Chaos influences, creating conditions where Forge world populations would voluntarily embrace heretical modifications to their existing practices. These innovations often addressed genuine problems or limitations in Imperial technology, making them attractive to tech adepts whose dedication to technological advancement could override their spiritual reservations about the source of new knowledge. The theological frameworks developed by corrupted tech adepts incorporated elements of traditional mechanicus doctrine while introducing interpretations that justified cooperation with chaos forces and the utilization of forbidden technological principles. These heretical teachings typically emphasize the pursuit of technological perfection as a spiritual imperative that transcended conventional moral limitations, presenting chaos corruption as a necessary step in the evolution toward true understanding of the Omnissiah's will. The most sophisticated tech heresy cults developed elaborate theological arguments that portrayed the Emperor as a false representation of the true machine god, while presenting the chaos gods as aspects of technological divinity that offered superior insights into the fundamental principles governing both mechanical and spiritual reality. The manufacturing capabilities maintained by corrupted Forge worlds under Iron Warrior's control produced weapons and equipment that incorporated both advanced Imperial technology and innovations derived from chaos research, creating hybrid systems that often exceeded the performance of purely Imperial or purely chaos equivalents. These production facilities manufactured demon engines that combined mechanical reliability with supernatural capabilities, weapons that incorporated both advanced materials science and warp-based enhancement techniques, and defensive systems that could adapt to changing tactical conditions through combinations of artificial intelligence and demonic possession. The most advanced corrupted Forge worlds developed manufacturing processes that could produce equipment tailored to specific operational requirements, creating custom weapons and systems designed for particular missions or environmental conditions. The distribution networks established by Iron Warriors controlled tech heresy cults extended far beyond their immediate Forge world bases to encompass trading relationships with other chaos factions, renegade Imperial forces, and criminal organizations that could provide raw materials, transportation services, or market access for corrupted technological products. These networks often operated through legitimate commercial channels that provided cover for the movement of heretical materials while maintaining plausible explanations for the advanced capabilities displayed by their products. The most successful distribution operations involved the gradual replacement of standard Imperial equipment with corrupted alternatives that provided superior performance, while slowly conditioning their users to accept increasingly obvious violations of orthodox Imperial technological doctrine. The Red Corsairs' approach to cult cultivation throughout the Maelstrom Zone represented a sophisticated example of how Chaos Space Marine forces could leverage existing criminal networks and political instabilities to create sustainable sources of recruits, resources, and intelligence that enhanced their military capabilities while extending their influence far beyond their immediate operational areas. Unlike other Chaos factions that focused primarily on direct military conquest or spiritual corruption, the Red Corsairs developed comprehensive strategies that incorporated political manipulation, economic exploitation, and social engineering to create conditions favorable to their long-term objectives. The Maelstrom Zone's unique characteristics, as a region of space dominated by warp storms and political instability, provided ideal conditions for Red Corsairs' operations, as the frequent disruptions in Imperial authority created opportunities for alternative power structures to emerge, while the dangerous navigation conditions limited Imperial ability to maintain consistent military presence throughout the region. The Red Corsairs exploited these conditions by establishing themselves as alternative sources of protection, trade facilitation, and conflict resolution for planetary governments and commercial organizations that found Imperial services inadequate for their needs. The cult networks established by Red Corsairs operatives typically began with the recruitment of individuals whose positions provided access to valuable resources or strategic information, including planetary governors whose worlds lacked adequate Imperial protection, merchant captains whose trade routes passed through dangerous areas of space, and military commanders whose forces were insufficient for their assigned responsibilities. These initial recruits received practical assistance that addressed their immediate needs, while gradually introducing them to Red Corsairs' philosophy and operational methods. The most successful recruitment operations involved the provision of military support that enabled local authorities to resolve conflicts or eliminate threats that had exceeded their independent capabilities. The economic relationships developed by Red Corsairs' cults often involved complex arrangements that provided mutual benefits while creating dependencies that made withdrawal from these relationships increasingly difficult over time. Planetary governments received protection services that enabled them to maintain independence from imperial oversight, while Red Corsairs' forces gained access to manufacturing facilities, recruitment populations, and strategic bases that enhanced their military capabilities. Commercial organizations obtained security escorts and favorable trade agreements that improved their profitability, while providing Red Corsairs with intelligence about imperial activities and access to transportation networks that could support covert operations. The military integration between Red Corsairs' forces and their cultivated cults created hybrid organizations that combine the tactical expertise and advanced equipment of Chaos Space Marines with the local knowledge and numerical strength of human auxiliary forces. These integrated units proved particularly effective in conducting operations that required both military capability and political sophistication, such as the conquest of worlds whose strategic value made direct assault impractical, or the elimination of imperial installations whose destruction required detailed knowledge of local conditions and defensive preparations. The most successful integrated operations involved careful coordination between Red Corsairs' special forces and cult military units, with each element contributing capabilities that enhanced the overall effectiveness of combined operations while maintaining operational security that prevented Imperial forces from developing effective counter-strategies. The cyclical nature of chaos corruption ensures that no victory against heretical cults, regardless of its completeness or the resources devoted to achieving it, can provide permanent security for Imperial civilization. Each successful purge operation eliminates specific cult organizations while leaving intact the fundamental conditions that enable new heretical movements to emerge from the same populations, institutions, and social structures that produced their predecessors. The psychological vulnerabilities that make Imperial citizens susceptible to chaos influence, desperation, ambition, curiosity, and the simple human desire for meaning in an existence dominated by suffering remain constant features of life within the Imperium, creating renewable sources of potential recruits for any organization capable of offering alternatives to Imperial orthodoxy. The Imperium's own structure contributes to this endless cycle through the harsh necessities imposed by its scale and the threats it faces. The authoritarian control required to maintain order across 1,000,000 worlds creates the very conditions of oppression and despair that chaos cults exploit in their recruitment efforts. Citizens living under constant surveillance, facing arbitrary punishment for minor infractions, or struggling to survive on inadequate rations become vulnerable to whispered promises of power, knowledge, or simple relief from suffering. The Imperium cannot eliminate these vulnerabilities without fundamentally altering its nature in ways that would leave it defenseless against the countless external threats that require centralized authority and ruthless efficiency to combat effectively. The institutional responses to chaos corruption often create their own problems that enable future heretical infiltration. Purges of suspected cultists inevitably eliminate innocent individuals whose only crime was association with actual heretics, creating resentment among survivors that makes them more susceptible to anti-imperial messaging. The destruction of contaminated facilities and the displacement of affected populations disrupts local communities and economic systems, creating the social instability that provides fertile ground for new cult formation. Even successful counter-cult operations leave behind psychological trauma, economic disruption, and social fragmentation that can persist for generations while creating conditions favorable to future heretical activity. The knowledge gained through each encounter with chaos corruption serves both Imperial defenders and potential cultists, as the intelligence gathered during investigation and elimination operations inevitably becomes available to heretical organizations through various channels. Corrupted Imperial personnel who escape purge operations carry detailed information about Imperial counter-cult procedures, enabling future heretical movements to develop more sophisticated security measures and operational protocols. The documentation of cult activities required for proper Imperial record keeping creates archives that can be accessed by individuals with appropriate clearances, providing blueprints for organizational structures and recruitment techniques that have proven effective against Imperial defenses. The spiritual dimension of this eternal struggle extends beyond simple military or intelligence operations to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of human consciousness and its relationship to the warp. Every human thought and emotion feeds into the Imperium, strengthening the very entities that seek to corrupt and destroy Imperial civilization. The fear generated by anti-cult operations empowers chaos as surely as the despair created by cult activities, while the hatred directed toward heretics provides spiritual nourishment for the same ruinous powers that inspire heretical worship. This feedback loop ensures that Imperial efforts to combat chaos corruption simultaneously contribute to the spiritual forces they seek to eliminate, creating a paradox that cannot be resolved through conventional military or administrative solutions. The role of chaos cults in preparing worlds for invasion by chaos space marine warbands and demon incursions represents perhaps their most strategically significant function within the broader ecosystem of chaos warfare. These organizations serve as advance forces that weaken Imperial defenses, gather intelligence about local conditions, and create conditions favorable to supernatural manifestation long before the arrival of conventional chaos military forces. The most effective cult operations can transform loyal Imperial worlds into staging areas for major chaos offensives while maintaining sufficient operational security to prevent Imperial authorities from recognizing the threat until it becomes too late to mount effective resistance. The intelligence-gathering capabilities of embedded cult networks provide chaos military commanders with detailed information about Imperial defensive preparations, troop dispositions, and strategic vulnerabilities that would be impossible to obtain through conventional reconnaissance operations. Cultists embedded within planetary defense forces can provide real-time updates on military readiness, while those positioned within administrative hierarchies can access classified information about reinforcement schedules, supply chain vulnerabilities, and command structure weaknesses. This intelligence advantage enables chaos forces to plan their operations with precision that maximizes their chances of success while minimizing the resources required to achieve their objectives. The sabotage operations conducted by cult networks in preparation for major chaos offensives target critical infrastructure systems, whose disruption can cripple Imperial defensive capabilities without triggering immediate security responses that might compromise ongoing infiltration efforts. Power generation facilities, communication networks, transportation systems, and manufacturing complexes all represent high-value targets whose subtle degradation can accumulate over time to create systemic vulnerabilities that become apparent only when Imperial forces attempt to respond to direct military threats. The most sophisticated sabotage campaigns involve coordinated attacks on multiple systems that create cascading failures exceeding the sum of individual disruptions. The psychological warfare aspects of cult preparation activities focus on undermining civilian morale and confidence in Imperial authority through carefully orchestrated campaigns that exploit existing grievances while creating new sources of discontent. Rumors about government corruption, stories of imperial military defeats, and reports of supernatural phenomena all serve to weaken popular support for imperial resistance while creating psychological conditions favorable to chaos influence. These campaigns often incorporate elements of truth that make them more credible, while gradually introducing fictional elements that serve specific chaos objectives. The spiritual preparation of invasion sites involves the establishment of ritual centers and the performance of ceremonies designed to weaken the barriers between real space and the immaterium, creating conditions where demon manifestation becomes easier while imperial psychic defenses become less effective. These activities typically begin months or years before planned military operations, gradually accumulating spiritual energy through regular ritual activities while establishing permanent alterations to local reality that persist even if individual cult members are eliminated. The most ambitious spiritual preparation campaigns can transform entire worlds into demon worlds where the normal laws of physics no longer apply consistently. The coordination between cult networks and incoming chaos forces requires sophisticated communication systems and timing mechanisms that can synchronize activities across vast distances while accounting for the unpredictable nature of warp travel. Cult leaders must maintain awareness of planned invasion schedules while adapting their activities to accommodate delays or changes in military planning that may occur due to warp storms, imperial interdiction efforts, or competing priorities within chaos command structures. The most successful coordination efforts involve multiple contingency plans that enable cult operations to provide maximum support regardless of specific timing or tactical approaches employed by arriving military forces. The balance between vigilance and paranoia in imperial society represents one of the most challenging aspects of maintaining effective defense against chaos corruption while preserving the social cohesion necessary for imperial civilization to function. The detection of heretical activity requires constant surveillance and investigation that can easily escalate into oppressive measures that create the very conditions of desperation and resentment that make populations vulnerable to cult recruitment. Imperial authorities must maintain sufficient security measures to identify genuine threats while avoiding the creation of police-state conditions that drive innocent citizens toward heretical alternatives. The psychological effects of living under constant suspicion create stress and anxiety that can manifest as the very behavioral changes that security services are trained to identify as indicators of potential corruption. Citizens who know they are being watched may develop nervous behaviors, secretive communication patterns, or expressions of discontent that appear suspicious to investigators despite having no connection to actual heretical activity. This dynamic creates false positive identification that wastes investigative resources while subjecting innocent individuals to scrutiny that may drive them toward the heretical alternatives they were initially accused of embracing. The social fragmentation that results from excessive security measures undermines the community bonds and mutual trust that provide natural resistance to cult recruitment efforts. When citizens cannot trust their neighbors, colleagues, or even family members to avoid reporting suspicious behavior to imperial authorities, the social isolation that results creates psychological vulnerabilities that cult recruiters are trained to exploit. The most effective cult recruitment often targets individuals who have been isolated from normal social support networks through security investigations, workplace purges, or community suspicion that may or may not have been justified by actual evidence of heretical activity. The institutional paranoia that develops within imperial organizations facing chaos infiltration can create internal conflicts and power struggles that weaken their effectiveness while creating opportunities for actual cult infiltration to occur undetected. When security services spend their resources investigating each other rather than external threats, when military units are paralyzed by suspicion of their own command structures, or when administrative departments cannot function due to constant investigations of their personnel, The resulting dysfunction creates gaps in imperial defenses that heretical organizations can exploit more easily than they could penetrate properly functioning institutions. The corruption of anti-cult efforts themselves represents one of the most insidious manifestations of this paranoia, as the fear of chaos influence can drive imperial personnel to adopt increasingly extreme measures that gradually incorporate the very brutality and moral flexibility that characterizes chaos corruption. Inquisitors who torture innocent suspects in pursuit of information about non-existent cult networks, military commanders who execute their own troops based on unsubstantiated suspicions of corruption, or administrators who implement policies that cause mass suffering in the name of preventing heretical influence, all demonstrate how the fear of chaos can become a corrupting influence in its own right. The ultimate fate of the Imperium in the face of the 13th Black Crusade and the opening of the Great Rift represents the culmination of 10 millennia of accumulated chaos corruption and the fundamental weaknesses that have plagued imperial civilization since its inception. The massive warp storm that now bisects the galaxy has created conditions where chaos influence can operate more freely, while imperial authority becomes increasingly difficult to maintain across the divided territories. The psychological impact of this catastrophe on imperial populations creates unprecedented opportunities for cult recruitment while straining imperial resources beyond their capacity to respond effectively to all emerging threats. The Great Rift's division of the Imperium into Imperium Nihilus and Imperium Sanctus has created two distinct operational environments that require different approaches to counter cult operations while sharing many of the same fundamental vulnerabilities. The worlds trapped on the dark side of the Rift face isolation from Imperial support, combined with increased exposure to warp influences that make chaos corruption both more likely and more dangerous when it occurs. The psychological despair created by apparent abandonment by the Emperor makes these populations particularly susceptible to heretical alternatives that promise divine favor or supernatural protection against the horrors that now dominate their local environment. The worlds that remain within Imperium Sanctus face different but equally challenging conditions, as the visible evidence of imperial vulnerability represented by the Great Rift undermines confidence in imperial invincibility, while the strain of supporting military operations across the divided galaxy creates economic and social pressures that enable cult recruitment. The massive military mobilizations required to respond to threats on both sides of the rift create opportunities for cult infiltration of military units, while the disruption of normal administrative oversight enables heretical organizations to operate with reduced risk of detection. The return of Roboute Guilliman and his efforts to reform imperial institutions provide hope for more effective responses to chaos corruption, but also create new vulnerabilities as traditional power structures adapt to accommodate his authority. The political instability created by major institutional reforms creates opportunities for cult infiltration, while the resistance to change from established imperial hierarchies can be exploited by heretical organizations seeking to capitalize on internal conflicts within imperial authority structures. The most sophisticated cult operations focus on exploiting the tensions between reformist and traditionalist factions within imperial institutions, presenting themselves as allies to whichever side offers the best opportunities for infiltration and influence. The Primaris Space Marine project represents a significant enhancement to imperial military capabilities, but cannot address the fundamental spiritual vulnerabilities that enable chaos corruption to persist throughout imperial society. The creation of superior warriors provides better tools for eliminating cult organizations once they are detected, but does nothing to prevent the formation of new heretical movements or to address the social conditions that make imperial citizens susceptible to cult recruitment. The most dangerous cult activities occur within civilian populations and imperial institutions where military force cannot be applied without causing massive collateral damage that may exceed the direct threat posed by heretical organizations. The technological innovations introduced through the recovery of archaeotech and the development of new imperial systems provide enhanced capabilities for detecting and combating chaos corruption, but also create new vulnerabilities as these technologies become targets for cult infiltration and corruption efforts. The most advanced detection systems require personnel with specialized training and security clearances that make them attractive targets for cult recruitment, while the complexity of new technologies creates opportunities for subtle sabotage that may remain undetected until critical moments when system failures can have catastrophic consequences. The eternal nature of the struggle against chaos corruption means that each generation of Imperial defenders must learn anew the lessons that their predecessors discovered through bitter experience, as the specific manifestations of heretical activity evolve in response to Imperial countermeasures, while the fundamental nature of the threat remains constant. The institutional memory that preserves knowledge of past cult activities provides valuable intelligence for current operations, but cannot anticipate all possible variations in heretical tactics or organizational structures that may emerge from the infinite creativity of chaos corruption. The ultimate futility of seeking permanent victory against chaos corruption does not diminish the importance of continued resistance, as each successful counter-cult operation preserves Imperial civilization for another day, while providing time for humanity to develop new approaches to the eternal threat. The sacrifice of countless Imperial servants in this endless war serves not to achieve final victory, but to maintain the conditions under which human civilization can continue to exist despite the constant pressure of chaos influence. The courage required to continue this struggle in full knowledge of its ultimate impossibility represents perhaps the highest expression of Imperial virtue and the most profound demonstration of humanity's refusal to surrender to the darkness that surrounds it. The legacy of 10 millennia of warfare against chaos cults demonstrates both the resilience of human civilization and the persistent nature of the threats it faces. Each cult eliminated, each heretical plot uncovered, and each demon banished back to the warp represents a small victory in an infinite war whose outcome remains uncertain. The Imperium endures not because it has found a way to permanently defeat chaos corruption, but because it has developed the institutional structures and cultural values necessary to continue fighting despite the knowledge that the struggle will never truly end. In this eternal conflict between order and chaos, between faith and corruption, between the light of the Emperor and the darkness of the warp, the very act of resistance becomes its own form of victory, preserving the hope that humanity might yet find a way to transcend the limitations that have defined its existence since the species first looked up at the stars and dreamed of something greater than itself.